The Nuremberg trials were without precedent in human history, and truly the first of their kind. Never before had such a gigantic trial been organised to deal out justice to the defeated side of a conflict. The Germans felt the trials were hopelessly biased and essentially show trials. In private, the victors boasted about how the trials were essentially a way of adding an air of legality to the punishment they so desperately wanted to mete out to the defeated. But what actually happened at the trials? Were they fair? Why were some condemned to death and others not? Did any of the Germans genuinely regret what they had done during the Hitler regime? The answer to most of these questions I will leave up to you to decide, and I will simply say what happened from beginning to end. This is the complete history of the Nuremberg trials. A few things before we begin. Firstly, a quick disclaimer. This video is entirely a work of history, and not political in the slightest, so please don't ever think it into being something it is not. Thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, I simply would not be able to do this for a living, and I cannot thank them enough. So, if you do want to support the channel, then please do click one of the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can imagine. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd actually like to thank David Irving and his team, who've sent me a large collection of his books for me to use in videos. For this particular video, of course, his book, Nuremberg, The Last Battle, proved to be absolutely invaluable and proved a great help, as it was the most coherent account of the trials I've read personally. The Irving team has also kindly given me a code which gives you 10% off on any of the products on his website. Many of you are, of course, familiar with the man, but the vast majority of you won't have read his work, as it'll have been before your time. Regardless of what you think of the man's politics or opinions, which many complain about, he is, after all, the man with the most sources when it comes to World War II and Nazi Germany, so his books are, of course, the king of the must-reads. I'll link his site down below, and the code is ZH10 for 10% off. Thank you. On the 18th of June, 1945, Justice Robert H. Jackson's plane touched down in London. President Truman had given Jackson the task of acting as Chief United States Prosecutor at the upcoming trials. Jackson was truly a man of ambition, and much of this entire operation had been his idea. He came here not only to prosecute the leaders of the recent war, but also to set a new precedent for future conflicts. He wanted to lay the foundations that would result in wars of aggression essentially becoming illegal in and of themselves. Even planning to wage a war would now essentially become a crime. His goals were the very definition of naive ambition, and here he was, wanting to punish every single organisation that had helped Hitler achieve all he did. The SS, the German General Staff, and of course, any individual involved were now to be fully investigated and brought to justice. Jackson knew full well how much new ground he was treading here. As soon as the plane touched down, he turned to his son, William, who was attached to his staff. Quote, "Bill, you're going to be defending me long after I am gone. That's why I want you to be there. I want you to see what it was all like." End quote. Jackson had quickly come to prominence back in the States. He had backed Roosevelt fervently and was himself a left-wing liberal. By 1940, he was even being tipped as a future president himself. In 1941, he was appointed to the Supreme Court. Jackson, as one of the most prominent American lawyers of his time, of course believed in the rule of law. Initially, he'd been skeptical about a trial at all. Quote, "If we want to shoot Germans as a matter of policy, let it be done as such, but don't hide the deed behind a court. If you were determined to execute a man in any case, there is no occasion for a trial. The world yields no respect to courts that are merely organised to convict." End quote. Initially, Jackson stood essentially alone, as the Brits and Americans longed for a bloody revenge. As the emotions of war slowly wound down, however, Jackson's legal route began to make the most sense. Even Roosevelt had absolutely no interest in any legal proceedings. In 1944, Roosevelt had openly boasted about following through with the Stalin plan of executing 50,000 German officers, as well as the ethnic cleansing that would take place in the areas that would soon become Polish. Henry Stimson, Secretary for War and devout Presbyterian, staunchly opposed this and urged his bloodthirsty president to tone it down. He too had stopped the Morgenthau plan from going ahead, as it was completely antithetical to his Christian faith. He wrote in his diary, quote, "I felt that repercussions would be sure to arise which would mar the page of our history if we, whether rightly or wrongly, seemed to be responsible for it." End quote. Stimson was the exception, not the rule. Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, had openly boasted to Lord Halifax about mass executions. Ambassador Halifax wrote, quote, Hull surprised me by saying that he would like to shoot and physically kill all the Nazi leaders down to quite low levels, end quote. General Eisenhower was of much the same opinion. He told Lord Halifax on the 10th of July, 1944, that all the enemy leaders should be, quote, shot whilst trying to escape death, end quote. What he meant by that is obvious. In the same vein, Eisenhower said to Henry Morgenthau, quote, the whole German population is a synthetic paranoid, and there is no reason for treating a paranoid gently. The best cure is to let the Germans stew in their own juice, end quote. He also proposed the death of every SS man. Quote, the ringleaders and the SS troops should be given the death penalty without question, but punishment should not end there, end quote. The General Staff should perish too, in his opinion. Quote, the German General Staff should be utterly eliminated, all records destroyed, and individuals scattered and rendered powerless to operate as a body. In proper cases, more specifically, punished, end quote. Importantly, Winston Churchill himself privately indicated his, quote, general concurrence with Eisenhower's viewpoint. Disagreement between these key players would later lead to the genocidal Morgenthau plan itself. Stimson, as noted, was the only man who really stood in the way, and indeed blew up Morgenthau, Churchill, and Eisenhower's plans. The elderly Republican wrote in his diary, quote, it is very interesting to find that army officers have a better respect for the law in those matters than civilians who are anxious to go ahead and chop everybody's head off without trial or hearing, end quote. Stimson said to Morgenthau over his infamous genocide plan, quote, this proposal will cause enormous evils. The Germans will be permanent paupers, and the hatreds and tensions that will develop will obscure the guilt of the Nazis and poison the springs of future peace, end quote. Morgenthau snapped back, quote, my plan will stop the Germans from ever trying to extend their domination by force again. Don't worry, the rest of Europe can survive without them, end quote. Stimson calmly parried this genocidal remark, quote, this plan will breed war, not prevent it, end quote. For better or for worse, no matter how one-sided the trial may be, Stimson and Jackson got their trials eventually. Morgenthau and his cronies tried every single underhanded method of making the president accept his post-war plan, and indeed, for a time, Morgenthau was successful. Stimson, however, was a man on a mission, a lone crusade, essentially, to save the people of Germany from destitution, destruction, and death. Through a Herculean effort, Stimson's pursuit of Christian justice won the day against Morgenthau's shadowy intrigues, at least for the most part. Those who wanted to chop everybody's head off now had a far harder task. Ironically, the only leader of the Big Three who agreed with Stimson was none other than Joseph Stalin. Churchill had for half a decade now been steadfast in his view that the Germans should be brutally punished after the war, and he recommended a political solution in which there would be mass executions. In fact, many German prisoners of war had already been secretly executed in the UK, and the file on this topic has been locked away. Stalin, however, saw things more clearly. The Soviets, if anything, are masters of the political trial. He replied to Churchill's idea, quote, whatever happens, there must be some kind of court decision. Otherwise, people will say that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were wreaking vengeance on their political enemies, end quote. There was a third view, which also failed to win the day like Morgenthau's. Duff Cooper had been one of the biggest advocates for war during the Chamberlain years, yet he saw things more logically at the end of the conflict. He proposed that a shameful exile would be preferable to death or imprisonment. He said that the exiles of James II, the Kaiser, and Charles X had been fatal to their dynasties, whereas the far harsher punishments meted out to Napoleon, Louis XVI, and Charles I had turned them into the stuff of romantic legends that would live on in perpetuity. In Hitler and Mussolini's case, Cooper had warned during the war that if harsh punishment was meted out, then their, quote, memories would be enshrined forever in the hearts of their people, end quote. Stimson's middle ground won out, however. The Morgenthau plan was trashed when the Christians opposing this treatment had the plan leaked to the press. All across the United States there was a united outcry of rage from the population, and especially unions. Many put it down to what Stimson called Morgenthau's, quote, Semitism gone wild for vengeance, end quote. With an election round the corner, Roosevelt simply could no longer take the risk of vassalizing himself to Morgenthau's ideas. The plan was scrapped, at least on paper. Duff Cooper's idea, of course, was seen as too mild for such a highly emotional war. After his defeat, Morgenthau and Churchill both continued to clamour about looking for support, yet none was forthcoming. James V. Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy, became a key man in stopping these later attempts by the ever-tricky Morgenthau. On account of his strong Catholic faith, he staunchly put to bed any such talk as far as his authority allowed. Quote, "The American people would not support the mass murder of the Germans, their enslavement, or the industrial devastation of the country." End quote. In this regard, both the devoutly Catholic Forrestal and the devoutly Presbyterian Stimson united from both sides of the religious divide to prevent what they saw as Morgenthau dragging their country into a thoroughly unchristian, and indeed, foreign and barbaric direction. Forrestal and Stimson met and discussed things with the heads of the Department of Justice and State, and put together their own plan and placed it before Roosevelt, essentially an ultimatum. Roosevelt, by now withering away and dying, chose to ignore the men and brought none of them to Yalta with him. Importantly though, Morgenthau did not come either. The exact way the defeated Axis leaders would be treated was still far from clear, but it was at least clear that Morgenthau wasn't going to get his way. Morgenthau continued to grovel to the president right up until his dying day. Even 24 hours before the polio-ridden president died, Morgenthau was there, presenting him with his plans, and essentially begging him to adopt it. Yet the sickly Roosevelt said nothing. His mind was by now gone. President Truman, the man who took Roosevelt's place, had very different views on international law, and so Morgenthau's hold on US policy was finally dead and buried. Across the pond, however, Churchill refused to let go, and he was out for blood. For months he had been pestering Stalin that at least 50 to 100 of the top Germans, Italians and Japanese should simply be shot without trial. Yet each and every time, ironically, the Soviet dictator who had not even signed the Geneva Convention insisted on proper proceedings. Churchill stubbornly pushed on, however, and he had quite a gang of yes-men in his corner who supported his cause back in London. In April 1945, the British, or rather Churchill's clique, made their views known to the Americans. Stimson once again was horrified. He wrote in his diary, quote, "The British, as I think I have reported in this diary, have come out strongly against having a trial and wish to kill the people offhand, a most singular position." End quote. A few days later in the same vein, he wrote, quote, "The British have to my utmost astonishment popped out for what they call political action, which is merely a euphemistic name for lynch law, and they propose to execute these men without trial. Sir John Simon agrees with the War Cabinet, who wish to execute them at once when they are captured. Fortunately, the Russians and the French are on our side." End quote. President Truman, by now holding the clearly leading position in the Anglo-American alliance, was firmly in favour of giving the losers a trial, which he naturally assumed would result in mass hangings anyway. On the 26th of April, it was Truman who asked Sam Rosenman, one of the key White House advisors, to make the call to Justice Robert H. Jackson. The United States were to seize the moral high ground and push hard for the trials to go ahead. Jackson quickly accepted, and by the 7th of May, the Soviet and British foreign ministers had formally agreed that trials should go ahead. Even now, within weeks, Jackson ran into issues. Morgenthau and his cronies had drafted a new plan, one in which they claimed was approved by Roosevelt right at the end. Of this, they had no proof, and this plan, according to Jackson, was essentially the same as the infamous plan of before. This new intrigue especially focused on the mass usage of German slave labour, which would be distributed to Russia, France and the UK, amongst others, to help rebuild their nations. Jackson sat in disbelief as he was read out these terms, and resolutely demanded to be shown proof that Roosevelt had agreed to them. Morgenthau, of course, could not provide them. Jackson would not be moved. He said that he would never consent to Germans being used as slaves all across Europe, just because, quote, "they are members of a vanquished race," end quote. Jackson commented later, quote, "They would make it farcical to conduct trials concerning the conspiratorial character of those organizations or the guilt of their membership. I think the plan to impress great numbers of laborers into foreign service, which means herding them into concentration camps, will largely destroy the moral position of the United States in this war," end quote. Jackson laid out his own, simple position, quote, "What the world needs is not to turn one crowd out of concentration camps and put another crowd in, but to end the concentration camp idea," end quote. Jackson brushed Morgenthau and his plans aside, and naively began to reassemble his team, assuming that his task would be far easier than it was actually going to be. Almost immediately, he ran into trouble. Most prominent were two issues. Firstly was the issue that there was zero preparation for such trials. No case was ready. Nobody knew who was guilty of what, and in some cases, the American OSS had trouble even knowing what was white propaganda and what was black, fake propaganda when it came to Nazi crimes. Secondly was a rather simple issue that hit Judge Jackson squarely in the face after the tiniest bit of digging. The Allies had committed pretty much every crime that they were about to accuse the Germans of. The defence, known in Latin as tu quoque, aka you did it too, loomed large over the trials. This latter issue especially applied to the Soviets, whom had partaken in the partition of Poland and massacred Polish officers by the thousands. The British, too, had openly invaded neutral countries during the conflict. The Americans themselves weren't squeaky clean either. There had been a surprisingly high number of high-profile cases of German POWs being massacred, and in Italy, many of the American troops had run rampant against the local female population amidst other atrocities. On the 15th of May, Jackson met with President Truman regarding the Morgenthau issue. The judge stated that he refused to support any slave labour unless they were Germans who were properly tried and convicted. The president replied, "I fully agree with you." Morgenthau was not done yet though. 3 days later, he and his clique met with Jackson at the Treasury Building, his home base. Morgenthau stated that there would simply not be enough slaves if they only used convicted Germans, as Stalin wanted around 5 million, whereas only a couple of 100,000 slaves could be obtained if there was a legal process. Once again, Morgenthau most likely lied and claimed that Roosevelt had fully supported all this on his deathbed. One of his cronies, Joseph Dubois, then chimed in and stated that there was no need for any trials at all and that a Gallup poll showed that the American population would support enslaving the Germans for Stalin's needs. Jackson, by now absolutely furious, slammed his fist down on the desk and shouted out, quote, "Just watch the Gallup poll ratings change when the first slave labor horror stories start coming out of Russia. The problem of sending labor to Russia is that I don't think it would ever come back," end quote. Dubois snapped back, quote, "We already know that the SS and Gestapo are guilty. A trial would be farcical," end quote. Jackson parried, quote, "How do you know? This city is full of people who tell me there's no doubt about it, but when I ask for specific evidence, I can't find a single item," end quote. Morgenthau, furious that he couldn't get his way, sneered, quote, "I bet you won't have your trials through by Labor Day," end quote. Jackson then left, leaving Morgenthau to seethe. No innocent Germans would be enslaved on Jackson's watch. As if to prove Jackson ever more right, he learned almost immediately upon leaving the Treasury that behind the scenes at Yalta, there had been talk of deporting millions of ordinary Germans to the Soviet Union, whereupon the men would be sterilized and the women would be bred with Russians. 5 days later, when Jackson was in Paris, Morgenthau's cronies launched a scathing attack on him in the Washington Post, which painted the judge as a German sympathizer who wanted a soft peace. Jackson, unfazed by Morgenthau's subversive antics, wrote in his diary, quote, "The poor idiots think they are planting something to hurt me. It will embarrass now, but it will be a great strength in time to come, if God really is in his heaven. Many are worried about the story. It may hurt our Russian relations. Washington is full of cowards, Gallup poll patriots," end quote. Until the day he died, Jackson refused to believe that Roosevelt had ever signed off on Morgenthau's mass slavery plan. Quote, "I can't believe that a man who knew history as well as he did, and knew the American people, ever had believed the proposal was a wise thing. I think myself that it was Morgenthau's emotional reaction. I don't know about the motives of some of the men with him," end quote. Before the big trial could go ahead, however, there was one problem. This was undoubtedly going to be the biggest trial in history, a drama that would unfold across the entire world, as everyone sat on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how this story, which had consumed the planet, ended. The lead actors of the drama, however, were not going to be in attendance, bar one. Hitler, Goebbels, and a whole host of other leading National Socialists had spoiled the fun and refused to give the Allies the satisfaction of putting them on trial by taking their own lives. In Italy, the same problem had occurred on a larger scale. However, under far murkier circumstances, communist partisans had captured Mussolini and his key ministers, yet they did not kill them immediately. Instead, they waited for orders. The partisans were in constant contact with the British Special Operations Executive, as were pretty much all partisans in Europe at the time, but especially the Italians. The theory, which seems incredibly likely, is that Churchill would pass instructions to the directors of the SOE, who then passed them on to their partisan contacts and agents. These instructions, needless to say, were the assassination of the leading Italian fascists, which Churchill had wanted all this time in all three of the major Axis nations. Heinrich Himmler, it appears, met the exact same fate at the hands of one of Churchill's hit squads. Suffice to say, either way, the communist partisans, or their British masters, had spoiled Jackson's party. In Himmler's case, if the theory is true, Churchill had robbed Jackson of the leader of the SS, the second most wanted man behind Hitler. All that Jackson was now left with was second-rate players and Hermann Goering. Initial treatment of the prisoners hardly boded well for Jackson's dream of a somewhat orderly trial. Hans Frank, the Nazi governor of Poland, despite complying completely, was immediately beaten to a pulp upon being taken into custody. On a scale of what was to come, this was light work. Julius Streicher, the loud-mouthed Gauleiter of Franconia, was driven off to a prison in Salzburg, where he was handcuffed for 5 entire days straight. Of these days, Streicher recalled, quote, 2 or 3 times a day, I was made to stand against the wall with my handcuffed hands above my head, while a black or a military police officer beat me around the genitalia for up to 1 minute at a time with a leather whip. If I attempted to ward off the blows with my handcuffed hands, they kicked me in the testicles. My private parts and testicles were badly swollen, end quote. On top of this, the Americans made him open his mouth 2 or 3 times a day so they could spit in it. If he refused, his mouth was prized open with a wooden baton. He was also forced to drink from the urinal, and if he refused, he was savagely beaten. Quote, each time he visited my cell, the white police officer ripped hairs out of my nipples and eyebrows, end quote. Another humiliating stunt occurred when a striker refused to eat the disgusting leftovers that were given to him. After this, he was forced to the ground and forced to lick the black officer's feet. On the final day before he was moved, the black officer marched Streicher into the toilets, threw his clothes into the dirty toilet, and demanded that he get dressed, despite being handcuffed. Streicher's treatment, compared to other, less important Germans, was mild. There was other trouble in Europe too. In late May, Jackson came to see the situation in Europe, and he found things rather different from the narrative back home. He said that he found Paris barely touched at all by the German occupation, and in his diary even suggested that it was suffering more under American occupation than German. When he went to Germany itself, he found that many Americans seemed to have a profound respect for the German army, yet the SS and Gestapo were viewed far more ominously. Most importantly, in Eastern Europe, the Soviets were rounding up leaders, intellectuals, lawyers, civil officials, scholars, priests, teachers, and pretty much anyone else who could prove a rallying point for future opposition, and simply mass murdering them. The lawyers, especially, hit a nerve within Jackson when he was given the news during his trip. In Yugoslavia, too, there was a communist reign of terror as Tito massacred his enemies, or even seemingly random civilians by the thousand. One example that struck Jackson to the core was that of the brother of a young woman who worked in the American embassy as a translator. The man was not tried, and no charges were placed against him. He was simply killed for being from a family of bankers. Despite all this, Jackson deployed his blinkers and kept focused on his task, despite his supposed allies' bloody retribution. After his Germany trip, the judge headed to London, and here there was a reality check for him too. He noted in his diary of the bomb damage in the capital, which had sounded far, far worse in American propaganda, quote, hardly noticeable in comparison with the total destruction visited upon the German cities, end quote. In London, the Americans sat down with their British counterparts and tried to get started on figuring out how this whole ordeal would work, and Jackson found the Brits barely interested at best. They were essentially just happy to let the Americans take the lead, and they had far less grand ideas about the whole thing than the Americans. When names were discussed, the British originally shot for a small list of around 10 major Nazis, and they imagined the whole thing would be over within 2 weeks. Jackson replied that he had something a little broader in mind. When it came to the question of punishment, British law would have allowed shooting, and there was some discussion about this, but ultimately hanging appears to be the most logical option for such a trial in case of death sentences. There was even talk of flogging, as British law still permitted whipping people convicted of burglary with violence or similar crimes. Yet Jackson dismissed this out of hand, as American public opinion would never stomach it. The Russians and the French, on the other hand, were lagging behind. Before leaving London, Jackson visited the Soviet ambassador and told him bluntly that the United States would be going ahead, either with or without the Russians. There was still, as always, more trouble back home. Henry Morgenthau continued to stick his nose in things and had demanded that the US Army begin to dismantle German industry, especially oil, gasoline, and the plants used to make them in the entire country. Stimson, as well as always, had to step in to halt the trickery. Upon his return to the US, Jackson was invited to a dinner party along with several senators, many under Morgenthau's influence. These men had been inundated with stories of what US troops had found in Europe, especially at the camps. The senators were out for blood and demanded summary executions. Senator Fulbright of Arkansas, the most liberal of the bunch, said there was no law under which the criminals could be tried. Quote, "Therefore, they must be executed forthwith as a political decision. A trial means delays, and it means giving the defendants a chance to tell their stories to the world." End quote. Jackson calmly responded, quote, "What are we afraid to hear them tell?" End quote. The senator had no answer to the question, and simply said that the Americans had the authority to kill Germans at will without trial. Much of the American public agreed with Jackson, yet this was changing fast. Morgenthau and others like him were whipping up an absolute propaganda storm, and soon enough, 67% of the American public, according to one Gallup poll, said that Hermann Goering should be executed without trial. 45% wanted every single Gestapo, SA, and SS man put to death without trial too, which would have meant millions of people. Jackson poured his heart out to President Truman regarding this mood in June, begging the president to stand firmly by him and his beloved trial. Quote, "To free them without a trial would mock the dead and make cynics of the living. On the other hand, we could execute or otherwise punish them without a hearing. But indiscriminate executions or punishments, without definite findings of guilt, fairly arrived at, would violate pledges repeatedly given, and would not sit easily on the American conscience, or be remembered by our children with pride." End quote. Soon enough, though, Jackson himself bended to the American public whim. He insisted that all the defendants be denied the privileges due to their rank as prisoners of war. Instead, all would be treated like major criminals. This act was a breach of international law. Compared to pretty much anyone else involved, however, Jackson still came off like a saint. Later on the 6th of July, he said in a speech to newspaper correspondents, quote, "Our effort is to preserve at all stages the essence of fair play, even towards those whom we loathe." End quote. On the 11th of June in New York, a few days before his big trip to London, Jackson, probably against his own wishes, had his first meeting with several powerful Jewish organizations who wanted a say in the running of the trial. They said that the Germans should be tried for the crime of anti-Semitism and shared their worries regarding whether this would be done. If this did not happen, they said, then they asked for a separate court to try the Germans on these charges, and said they had the right to, quote, "represent the 6 million slaughtered," end quote. Jackson promised to think about it, but worried that all persecuted minorities would then seek the same rights as the Jews. The men clearly noticed that they had failed in their task, and so asked Jackson if they could at least get an officer appointed to his staff, specifically to handle their Jewish angle. Jackson was evidently less than impressed, as right after the meeting he took to his diary and denied the victim estimate he'd been presented with. Quote, "I was particularly interested in knowing the source and reliability of his estimate, as I know no authentic data on it." End quote. By mid-June, after Jackson had made his trip, the four powers were able to finally sit down and get to work, yet this proved harder than expected. Everyone in Jackson's own camp began to fall out with each other, and little to no progress was made between the four powers. Jackson even had to send home one of his secretaries because, quote, "she became hysterical and could not cope with the unaccustomed tensions, and the trials had not even begun," end quote. One of the key issues in the early days was who to actually include on the list of defendants. One of the key names which caused contention was that of Rudolf Hess. The man had been in Allied custody since 1941 and had taken no part in most of the war's most egregious events, yet many still wanted to include him. Others felt that including such a man was ridiculous, especially as he had essentially lost his mind over the past few years in British captivity. Another issue was where to actually host the trials. Most of Germany was in ruins from the Allied terror bombing campaign, and this was one key issue that had been overlooked. Did any city in Germany even have the facilities anymore to house such a massive endeavour? The first location Jackson suggested was Munich, but as it turned out, the city was ruined, much like the rest of Germany. Progress soon became even slower once the main Russian delegation arrived. Jackson lamented in a letter home, quote, "Their life and tradition and experience are so different that even after translation of language it is hard to understand each other," end quote. The biggest issue with the Russians was their severity. To the Russians, this trial would be like the ones they had back home, show trials. General Nikitchenko, the chief Soviet prosecutor, simply put it, quote, "We are dealing here with the chief war criminals who have already been convicted, and whose conviction has already been announced by both the Moscow and the Yalta declarations, and by the heads of the governments," end quote. Essentially, the Russians were just here to get things moving along, so they could hurry up and execute all the defendants already in the all too familiar methods of the Soviet Union. They refused to work with Jackson on almost anything, and their stubbornness was driving the other free nations up the wall. President Truman had already offered Jackson the advice earlier that the Russians would only respect people who stood up to them, and this was becoming evident very quickly. By late July, however, Jackson, essentially single-handedly, had dragged things into shape. A destination had been chosen, and the entire ordeal now looked entirely possible. On the last day of July, 1945, before heading off to Nuremberg, Jackson had another visitor, much like he had had in New York. Zionist leader Dr. Chaim Weissman lunched with Jackson at the famous Dorchester Hotel in London, and once more, he pled the special rights of the Jews at the trial, since in his view, they were the only people who had undergone a systematic policy of extermination. Jackson, once again, said that this was a terrible idea, and seemingly was becoming somewhat anti-Semitic himself. He felt his staff was already overloaded with Jews, and had set himself a new guideline, in which there would be no new Jews employed by him, the only guideline of its kind. After the war, he would reminisce, quote, "I had a great deal of argument and difficulty about the staff, particularly with the Jewish people and politicians. We are prosecuting these Nazis, not because they killed Jews, but because they killed men and women," end quote. Jackson was anxious for the trial not to come across as vengeful, and this was how Jews such as Morgenthau, Weissman, and the Jews in New York were making it apparent they wanted Jackson's trial to go. Jackson, during his meeting with Weissman, did buckle, however, and offered a rather large concession. He would employ one more Jew, Dr. Robert Kempner. This man caused immense trouble, and the Americans, according to Jackson's son, regarded him as somewhat of a joke. Jackson, however, stood by him till the end and retained him. However, after the fact, he would state that he regretted keeping Kempner on, as he was a great example of the very vengeful kind of justice Jackson wanted to avoid. Kempner had fled Nazi Germany in 1935, as many Jews had, and thus had skin in the game. Irving writes of the problems he caused, quote, "Returning now to Nuremberg in 1945, Kempner swore revenge at any price. In doing so, he put behind him the strict ethics of which he had been brought up in the law in Weimar Germany. Preparing the prosecution case, he frequently resorted to threats and coercion to get witnesses to change or withdraw inconvenient evidence. Dr. Friedrich Gauss, Ribbentrop's legal advisor, was one witness thus intimidated. He would be suddenly stricken with amnesia about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the signing of which he had actually witnessed in Moscow. Gauss later testified that Kempner had threatened to turn him over to the Russians. In the files, there is also a memorandum from Colonel Telford Taylor warning Kempner that he was not to promise inmates early release as an inducement during interrogation," end quote. As for the defendants themselves, they were now grouped together in Luxembourg at a requisitioned 4-star hotel, the Mondorf. The US Army sarcastically gave the hotel the name Ashcan, and the British Dustbin. Here, over 70 elite prisoners sat about and awaited their fate, under the command of American cavalry colonel Burton Andrus, whom would move with them to Nuremberg and remain in charge of them until they moved on to their final destination, whether that be freedom, jail, or wherever God felt fit to send them after their execution. His main task was to make sure these men actually faced justice. Konrad Henlein, Gauleiter of the Sudetenland, had already slashed his veins in Allied captivity and joined his Führer in the afterlife. Victor Buehler, head of the euthanasia program, had chosen the same fate for himself. A suicide capsule had already been found on Hermann Goering, who was now at Mondorf, and there was now strict procedures to prevent such untimely suicides. If anyone was going to die, it would be at a time and place of Allied choosing, aka the gallows at Nuremberg. Most of the men at Mondorf had essentially accepted their fate. To most, the idea of lying their way out was anathema, given that so many of them were Prussian types, where their honour was everything. Some became depressed, others calmly awaited their fate. Hermann Goering was a strange mix of both, as he realised there was no way out. One man, who desperately clamoured for a way out, no matter what, was Albert Speer. Speer, having failed at every attempt so far to avoid being locked up at all, was now trying his fourth strategy. He had worked hand in glove with the Americans, and suddenly decided to inform them that actually he'd been planning to murder Hitler all this time. At his 7th interrogation session, Speer asked that what he was about to say be kept off record, and that no notes be kept, which of course the Americans promised to do, but did not actually do. Here is what the questioner wrote down, quote, "In February 1945, Speer had intended to organise a 2nd July 20. As the builder of Hitler's Reichschancellery and its underground bunker, he was closely acquainted with its structural details. Hitler's daily conferences on the situation were held in the bunker, and Speer proposed to obtain some poison gas and have it pumped into the bunker during one of these conferences. In this way, he hoped to eliminate in one blow the whole faction which was in favour of continuing the war, including Hitler himself. Speer had asked Brandt to procure the poison gas, and Speer was going to arrange for its introduction to the conference room through a ventilator shaft. He claims that there are other witnesses to his plans, whom he did not name. He changed his mind on his subsequent visit to the Ruhr, where he saw that not only the Gauleiters, but also many common miners, still had a pathetic faith in the Führer and his ability to bring the war to a successful end. Their attitude convinced Speer that the only way of curing the German people from its delusions and the state of mind brought about by years of propaganda and isolation from the outside world was to make them drink the cup of bitterness and be thoroughly disillusioned. Anything that afterwards might be presented to them as internal treason, which ended the war by a stab in the back, would disturb their mental regeneration process. He therefore abandoned his plan." End quote. On top of this, Speer declared that he had planned to capture Himmler and deliver him to the Allies, and he denied knowing what was going on at the slave labour camps, which he himself was the biggest exploiter of. Karl Hanke, Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, had once told Speer never to ask what was going on at a place named Auschwitz. Speer chose to keep this information to himself until later in life. Speer had also taken a key part in the deportation of masses of Jews to make way for his slum clearing program, so the bombed out victims of Allied bombings could be housed. Speer chose to blame much of this on others, who ultimately would end up getting the noose, which he himself should have been destined for. Speer's strategy worked. To the amazement of his fellow prisoners, he was suddenly led away and taken to a luxury castle near Frankfurt, where he lived peacefully, able to enjoy the bountiful American army rations, whilst those outside the castle starved. He was free to come and go as he pleased until, to his surprise, he was told in September that he was going to be put on trial for war crimes at Nuremberg. Other prisoners, as noted, stood firm. Alfred Jodl had been taken to Mondorf, and as he had left his first prison camp at Flensburg, the American officers had presented arms. He was even invited to write a strategic survey of Germany and the defence of Western Europe, which attracted favourable comment in Washington. Jodl was well on his way to escaping the hangman's noose, yet there was one hiccup. He refused to disavow his Führer and remained utterly unrepentant. When asked whether Hitler, after committing suicide in his own capital, could be regarded as a famous warlord, Jodl proudly stated, quote, "Rome destroyed Carthage, but Hannibal is still regarded as one of history's greatest warriors and always will be." End quote. This comment spread through the camp like wildfire, and the Americans cracked down hard on dissent and had atrocity films shown to the Germans to perhaps change their minds and get them to repent. There was one issue, however. These initial films were very sloppy. Many of the piles of corpses spliced into these films were from German cities after being bombed by the Allies. These weren't the victims of the Germans themselves. One former Messerschmitt worker even recognised himself in the tapes. It was very clumsy propaganda indeed, and probably just hardened the Germans' resolve to remain unrepentant. In fact, a spirit of competitiveness even prevailed amongst some who saw themselves as doomed in the camp. When Hermann Göring noticed that his rival, Admiral Dönitz, was at the same camp as him in Luxembourg, he remarked to the Admiral's adjutant, quote, "You can be quite certain that if we're for the high jump, mine will be the first head into the noose." End quote. Soon enough, though, all of the prisoners, whom had squabbled for years in freedom before this, began to squabble with each other in the inside, and the Allies took full advantage. Robert Ley said of Göring, quote, "Göring was never able to win the heart of the workers. He was considered a comical figure, the pussbag, not only of the party, but of Germany as well." End quote. Streicher mocked Göring in his interrogations too. Quote, "At Mondorf, he actually wrote a letter to complain about the quality of the food. He still felt every inch the Reichsmarshal. He always was a glutton, and always will be. Poor guy. He thinks that if we were to get out now, the people would greet him with Vestal virgins. As if." End quote. The Americans even went around between the defendants and made up stories that the other defendants had told them about each other, and soon enough everyone was singing like a canary about each other's misdeeds, but especially about Göring, who had made an enemy of pretty much everyone else over the years. Göring, despite all this, tried to defend himself. He said he had never wanted this war and that the Americans could put nothing on him. Streicher, who was present, simply replied to him, quote, "The Jews will make sure enough that we hang." End quote. Another of the defendants awaiting their fate at Mondorf was Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. In August, he was interrogated regarding the pact with the Soviets in 1939, to which he refused to comment, stating diplomatic secrecy. The British interrogator then moved on to the camps. Ribbentrop denied any knowledge of them, and stated that the camps were entirely Himmler's domain, as well as perhaps Bormann, and that no one else ever saw them or knew what was going on. The interrogator then asked, "Do you think Hitler knew?" David Irving writes in his book on Nuremberg, quote, "After a long, painful pause, Ribbentrop replied, 'I have so often thought about that. It would absolutely ruin my picture of Hitler if I thought this. I know one thing, that after the Russians had taken the concentration camp in Poland, Majdanek, I think it was called, that was the first time I heard of these persecutions in concentration camps, misdeeds, atrocities. This was the first thing I heard when our representatives from abroad sent telegrams that Russian propaganda was making a tremendous row in neutral countries. I got these telegrams and placed them before the Führer. I said that if this were true in any respect, it would be quite impossible to make foreign policy. So he took the matter in hand and said it was not my business to discuss this. That's the only thing I ever heard. The British officer asked if he had seen any pamphlets. Ribbentrop replied, quote, I have seen one film in Mondorf. It was shown to us. It was a terrible film. There is no doubt about that. There was some propaganda. You see, we saw in a number of pictures where it was quite evident that it was done after bombardment. If you ask me about Himmler, he concluded, in the last years, he was very touchy. Sehr böse. The adjective actually translates as wicked, end quote. Julius Streicher, the head of the infamously anti-Jewish newspaper Die Stürmer, was in Luxembourg with the others too. This loud-mouthed ex-school teacher had been with the Führer since the very start, but had long since fallen out of favour and been in a form of self-imposed internal exile, having no contact with the Nazi hierarchy during the war years. His unrepentant anti-Semitism, even now, however, led many to keep their distance from him in his confinement. Streicher had long since memorised the anti-Jesus sections of the Talmud and considered himself an expert in Jewish subversion. Even Hitler and Goebbels had found him too much at times, and his newspaper was entirely beyond the pale to them, and they had no control over it, as he wrote about Jews wanting to enforce multiculturalism and multi-racism, week in, week out, as well as constant references to Jewish ritual murder of Christian children. Streicher's propaganda paper had for a long time now made him one of the most hated men in Europe amongst the victorious nations, and now everyone knew he was never going to get out of here alive. He remained in good spirits, however, and Dönitz was heard to whisper to him as they were carted off to Nuremberg, quote, I'm not worried about you, but I wonder how the others are going to come through, end quote. By now, Nuremberg had been chosen as the site of the trials, and on the 12th of August, the 70 prisoners were transferred there from Mondorf, either as defendants or witnesses. Firstly, a strange procedure began, in which Göring, Keitel and others were discharged from the German armed forces and then formally arrested. Milch, who had this same procedure happen to him a few weeks later, lectured the Americans, quote, You were not the ones who appointed me, nor can you discharge me, end quote. The entire point was that if the Germans were discharged, then they would no longer be under the protection of the Geneva Convention as prisoners of war. Now they could be prosecuted and hung. On the 14th of August, the structure of how the trials would take place was finalised. There would be four power committees, one on aggressive war and the violation of treaties, led by the British, 2 committees to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity on the Eastern and Western Front, the former under the Russian and the latter under French chairmanship, whilst the Americans would lead the planning committees on organisations and on the conspiracy to wage aggressive war. As for Nuremberg itself, it was still in ruins. Only a few streets had been cleared, after over 90% of the city had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The civilians themselves lived in the most pitiful conditions amidst the rubble, starving to death. The prosecutors, however, saw a rather different Nuremberg. Jackson's son reported, quote, The army has sent a whole regiment in there to take care of us. Drivers, telephone operators, mimeograph operators, guards, post office, post exchange, tailor shop, barber shop, etc. Everything you could possibly think of, including a nightclub, end quote. The defendants, as expected, lived in extremely well-prepared quarters. Quote, The main defendants were housed in low-ceilinged cells, barely 7 feet wide by 13. They slept on metal cots, bolted to the floor along the left-hand wall. To one side of each cell's narrow steel door was a porcelain toilet bowl, set back slightly in an alcove. It was the one place which the sentinels, permanently watching their prisoner through the door's peephole, could not see. As at Mondorf, every glass window had been ripped out and replaced with perspex. All electric wiring had also gone. Security and anti-suicide measures were paramount. While meetings with the prosecution officers were conducted across tables, those with defense lawyers were confined to rooms where lawyer and client were separated by thick glass partitions, and a sentinel had to sniff all documents passed through the slide to make sure they had not been steeped in poison. At 7 a.m. each day, a prison trustee handed each prisoner breakfast and a spoon through the Judas hole in the steel door. Water was poured through the peephole from a watering can into a tin mug, of which the handle had been ripped off, another security precaution. The barber then came and shaved him. A truncheon-toting sentinel stood by to ensure that nobody spoke. Sentinels, moving back and forth on the catwalks, view the prisoners every half minute, reported Andrus to Jackson. At 6 p.m. each evening, the prisoners' eyeglasses, pen, and wristwatch were removed, and the dim cell light was switched off at 9:30 p.m. A spotlight glared through the Judas hole all night long into the prisoner's face, the only concession being that the current flowing through the lamps was reduced at night time from 220 to 110 volts. End quote. Bill Jackson, Judge Jackson's son, told his father of walking through the jail and seeing the inmates, finding these big personalities now locked in a cage very strange. Ribbentrop, furiously writing his defense, was annoyed at being disturbed, and Jodl was just sat there, staring glassily into nothingness. In Hermann Goering's cell sat a collection of precious pictures so dear to him. His first wife, Karin, his current wife, Emmy, his parents, and of course his darling daughter, Edda. A picture of little 7-year-old Edda sat there with writing on the back from her, reading, quote, "Dear Daddy, come back to me again soon. I have such longing for you. Many thousand kisses from your Edda." End quote. The prisoners were allowed pencils and paper to write letters, but these were confiscated and sent to the chief of interrogation, and the prisoners were left puzzled when they got no replies. In October, Keitel noted, quote, "We've been permitted to write letters and postcards for 2 months, but no replies have been received." End quote. This was intentional and part of a systematic wearing down of the prisoners. In this same vein, they were given meagre rations and a severe lack of exercise. These measures worked immediately, and by late August, the health and general morale of all the prisoners was in clear decline. Goering was even suffering repeated heart attacks, which he was just left to deal with in agony in his cell. Eventually, Colonel Andrus, the strict disciplinarian overlooking these measures, was told in no uncertain terms by an American doctor that Hermann Goering must be allowed 30 minutes of exercise each day, or his next heart attack would be his last. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the mass collection of evidence to be used against the defendants began. There was such a mountain that many began to doubt if the trials would even go through on time. Much of it was very conveniently cherry-picked. There is anecdotal evidence that in the forests outside Nuremberg, the prosecutors made a bonfire one day of all the documents which could aid the defense case. Other documents also vanished, such as Hitler's correspondence with Eva Braun, his private diaries, the diaries of Lammers, Himmler, and Goering. All of these had been plundered by US troops around Berchtesgaden. The British had seized General Jodl's diaries, and many of them simply vanished too. Kempner, the man mentioned earlier, whom Jackson added as essentially a concession diversity hire to his team, stole Alfred Rosenberg's diaries and kept them hidden until his death, making them unavailable to Rosenberg, who desperately needed them for his defense. Needless to say, all these documents would have greatly helped the defendants in their cases, yet the Allies were in no rush to recover or hand back these documents, and the defendants had to go without, somehow. The squabbling over who to even prosecute continued right up until the deadline too. In a memorandum titled Keitel, Dönitz, Schacht and Krupp as war criminals, a British Foreign Office official stated plainly that only Keitel was fit to be included, based on the evidence. The 3 others, he said, quote, should be acquitted. The case against Dönitz is very much weaker, end quote. On the 28th of August, Jackson was handed a staff analysis on Dönitz, which stated that the British Admiralty had determined, quote, there is insufficient evidence to sustain a charge against Dönitz, end quote. The author of this analysis, an officer writing on behalf of the US Navy Department, also added, quote, unless additional information implicating Dönitz in political, as distinguished from military acts of criminality has been uncovered in the Foreign Office or elsewhere, it is believed that there is insufficient evidence to convict him or warrant his being tried. If, as it has been somewhat facetiously said, we should have some defendants whom we can acquit, then we should be wary lest we afford other defendants the opportunity to profit by such defence evidence, as Dönitz undoubtedly can introduce on his own behalf, end quote. Both the British and American Admiralty agreed on Dönitz's innocence, yet on the list he went. Similar discussions took place over Hjalmar Schacht and Krupp. And I say Krupp because the Allies didn't know exactly which of the Krupp family to prosecute. The plan was just the younger Krupp, yet on the 25th of August, the elder Krupp had crept back onto the list. By the 29th, with 2 days to go before the list's deadline, the list was 22 names long. The British had warned months ago not to make it more than 10, yet here it was, at over double the recommended amount of names. More were added literally at the last minute too, as Grand Admiral Raeder and Hans Fritsch, Goebbels' principal radio commentator, were suddenly added as the Russians announced they had them in their hands. Jackson saw absolutely zero logic in the last pick, yet the Russians insisted, most likely because he was one of the few high-ranking Nazis they had actually managed to capture. On the 1st of September, the list was announced, and Gustav Krupp's name, not his son's, was still on it. Jackson resigned himself to the list and sent off his assistant to go and serve the indictment to Gustav at his hunting lodge above Salzburg. Here, it was shown how little the Allies actually knew about the men they were trying to execute or imprison. Gustav Krupp was a barely living vegetable who had suffered several major strokes over the past few years, and he could neither speak nor understand, looked after by his equally as aged wife. One of the American judges remarked, quote, "The American doctor who made a report on his condition thinks probably it would kill him if he were brought here, but I think the Russians would insist on that course," end quote. Eventually, the Russians ended up agreeing with the Americans' logic and dropped the senile old man. Martin Bormann was also on the list, yet no one knew what had happened to him, and so the list went back down to 22 men, those being the following: Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe; Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy and Hitler's successor; former Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, former Commander-in-Chief of the Navy; Dr. Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland; Dr. Wilhelm Frick, Reich Minister of the Interior; Hans Fritsch, Chief Radio Commentator; Dr. Wolfgang Funk, Reich Minister of Economics and Reichsbank President; Rudolf Hess, former Deputy Führer; Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Chief of the Reich Main Security Office; Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of Staff, High Command of the Armed Forces; General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the OKW Operations Staff; Dr. Robert Ley, Leader of the German Labour Front; Konstantin von Neurath, former Foreign Minister and later Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia; Franz von Papen, Vice-Chancellor until 1934, and then Ambassador to Turkey later; Joachim von Ribbentrop, Foreign Minister; Reichsleiter Alfred Rosenberg, Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories; Gauleiter Fritz Saukel, General Plenipotentiary for Manpower; Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, Reich Minister of Economics until 1937, and Reichsbank President until 1939; Baldur von Schirach, Hitler Youth Leader and Gauleiter of Vienna; Dr. Arthur Seyss-Ingaert, Reich Commissar of the Netherlands; Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Munitions; and Gauleiter Julius Streicher, Gauleiter of Franconia and publisher of Die Stürme. At the time of the list's announcement, Jackson was off in Italy, enjoying the sun at the US Army's hotel on Capri. Here, he was informed of the fate of the leading Italian fascist leaders. He was told they had been thinned out pretty thoroughly, and that they have been ruthlessly treated. He inquired no further than this, which is odd, as he was currently running an international tribunal, which would have done well to have Mussolini and the like on board. In Rome, there was further signs that the Italians had been deliberately murdered. US Army Colonel Charles Paletti, whose military government territory included northern Italy, said that the, quote, fascist criminals, end quote, had been pretty much eliminated, quote, or are in the process of elimination, end quote. After this, Jackson, a Protestant and a Freemason, went to visit the Pope to ask if he had any evidence. The Pope agreed to provide any evidence that might help, but begged Jackson not to punish the entire German people for the crime of individuals. Jackson noted, quote, he was especially concerned that the whole German people should not be charged with criminality. He thought that was unwise and unfair, for he knew that many people had incurred considerable risk in opposing the Nazi regime, end quote. Next, it was on to the American ambassador in Rome, Alan G. Kirk, who told Jackson that he had a profound respect for Hermann Göring, and thought that he was an aristocrat who had no real liking for the Nazis and their ways. Jackson would after this write in his diary that he was worried that the doctors were whittling down Göring's drug dosage too fast, and he might die from a heart attack as a result. Quote, I was concerned lest he die, and was not in the least concerned that he be reformed, end quote. AKA, he wanted to keep Göring alive just long enough so that the tribunal could have the joy of executing him themselves. A heart attack would feel like Göring cheated them out of their great spectacle. By now, Jackson and the Americans at large were urging the world, and indeed, using diplomatic pressure to make every country identify themselves with the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. 19 of Germany's enemies did so, yet interestingly, 2 did not, Canada and South Africa. Regardless, the Americans had the recognition they needed, and this entire ordeal had been Jackson's doing, and it had indeed taken a truly Herculean effort. He wrote privately a year later, quote, our agreement of London of August the 8th, 1945, went beyond anything in history in its explicitness in outlawing aggressive war, but conditions which made for the success of those negotiations do not exist today. All governments had recently pledged to their own people that they would punish the Nazi war criminals. The only thing unsettled was the procedure and charges. On these matters, the United States held all the aces, and we played them for all they were worth. The Americans had most of the high-ranking prisoners, and we had captured the important evidence. Nobody else could conduct a really impressive trial without us. On the other hand, we were in a position to conduct such a trial without the help of any other nation. Repeatedly during the negotiations, I took the position that the United States would proceed alone to deal with its own prisoners if we could not come to an agreement. This was very persuasive in obtaining agreement on principles and methods, but even with these aces in my hand, I was unable to get a definition of aggressive warfare written into the agreement, although I proposed the one which, in substance, had previously been agreed to by Soviet Russia in treaties with the Baltic states." End quote. The trial was now officially going ahead, and the process had begun, yet there were still issues back home, as everyone believed the trials were doomed to fail. Many lawyers, even the Chief Justice of the United States, disagreed with the trials in general and didn't want their profession being wrapped up in what they deemed to be a show trial. Their claims went entirely unfounded. Irving writes at length, quote, "Not only were the Allies seeking to convict their enemies under laws which had not existed at the time of the alleged offences, but under the London Statute, they were specifically ruling out a number of obvious defences which would have immediately been raised. The German defendants might not plead that as soldiers in a Führer state, they were bound to obey the orders that were issued to them, nor could they point out that on more than one occasion, each of the prosecuting powers had committed precisely the same crimes as they were alleging against the Germans. The tribunal would hold that the London Statute was a valid exercise of the legislative power of the only sovereign authority for Germany, and Lord Justice Lawrence, the British president of the tribunal, would recall that it had been laid down long before by Lord Mansfield in a famous case, Campbell versus Hall, that conquest invested the conquering power with the prerogative right to make what law he pleases. It was a case which Adolf Hitler might equally have invoked in his defense had he shown much inclination to be guided by case law. In vain would the defense lawyers argue that this was ex post facto or retroactive justice. As far as crimes against the peace are concerned, they declared, the current proceedings have no lawful basis in international law, but are a trial based on new criminal law, a law drawn up only after the actions complained of. They argued further that the cast iron principle of in the absence of a law there can be neither crime nor punishment was a general rule, which in normal circumstances would militate against the punishment of people for acts which were not against the law at the time committed. Nuremberg, said the tribunal simply, was an exception. Insofar as this is an appeal against the jurisdiction of the tribunal, ruled Lord Justice Lawrence, rejecting the defence application, it conflicts with Article 3 of the statute, and it cannot be entertained. Besides, it might be argued, in view of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, to which Germany was a party, aggressive war was already a crime by 1939. The retroactive nature of the Nuremberg legislation nonetheless troubled many legal minds, and few greater than that of the Justice of the US Supreme Court, William O. Douglas. In our view of the law, he would write, nobody can be convicted on the basis of having broken an ex post facto law. In my view, the Nuremberg trials applied this kind of law against the defendants. Hitler and his ilk were guilty of multiple murders and under common law deserved the death penalty, but they were indicted under the relevant national laws. Before the Nuremberg trials, the crime of which the Nazis were convicted was never considered to have been such an act under our criminal laws, nor was it held by the international community to be under threat of the death penalty." End quote. The just following orders defence was going to be a major problem too. In both British and German law, this was a perfectly reasonable defence, and all British trials of enemy war criminals since 1914, according to the Geneva Convention, and their Manual of Military Law legally had to follow the following. Quote, "It is important to note that members of the armed forces who commit violations of the recognised rules of warfare, such as are ordered by their government, or by their commanders, are not war criminals, and cannot therefore be punished by the enemy." End quote. German law said much the same. Quote, "If a criminal law is violated in the execution of an order, the superior issuing that order is alone responsible, but the subordinate obeying that order is liable to punishment as an accomplice. Firstly, if he exceeds the terms of the order issued to him, or secondly, if it was known to him that his superior's order meant committing an act which would be a crime or misdemeanor under civil or military law." End quote. The American laws, too, followed the same trend. Quote, "Members of the armed forces are not punished for these crimes, provided they were committed on the orders or with the permission of their government or commanders." End quote. To counter this issue when it came to the Germans, both the British and the Americans suddenly changed this extremely important clause in 1944 in preparation for the end of the war. Another penalty placed on the defendants was that they were not allowed to refer in mitigation to illegal acts committed during the war by the victors. During the trials, Lord Justice Lawrence would reply to a German lawyer who tried this tactic, quote, "We are not trying whether any other power have committed breaches of international law or crimes against humanity or war crimes, but whether the defendants have," end quote. Regardless, whether the trial was fair or not, the show had to go on, and the days continued to tick by. These days, however, had not been kind to the prisoners. Like the rest of the Germans throughout their occupied homeland, these high-profile prisoners were still on a near-starvation diet. Between May and October, the 63-year-old Keitler lost 33 pounds. Ribbentrop now looked hollow-cheeked and a shell of his former self. Hess especially looked like a shell of his former self, almost ghost-like, his mind completely gone. Keitel would lament in his private papers, quote, "The conditions we are living under here are not enviable given the last 5 months of uncertainty about the fate of our people, our family, and our own person. Apart from the interrogations, we hear nothing whatever about what is going on in the world outside the prison, and even then, only by chance. We have been allowed to write letters and postcards for 2 months now. No replies have been received," end quote. Conditions themselves were solitary confinement in all but name. After 5:30 p.m, the tables and chairs were removed from the cells, as well as the prisoners' eyeglasses. The elderly inmates could do nothing but sit and stare into darkness, unable to even read without the light. Quote, "The needs of personal hygiene which are provided for with soap, toothpaste, and a once-weekly shower are incapable of keeping pace with the unhygienic side of life in a prison cell, to filthy mattresses, blankets, towels, etc." End quote. As for exercise, the men were allowed only 10 minutes in the open air or outside in the gangway per day. No more. In a way, however, things were perhaps worse on the outside. The ever-scheming Morgenthau had got his way after all. Jackson had seen instructions which ordered as many as 2 million Germans to be rounded up as criminals, and the judge protested to no end. But soon enough, his suspicions were confirmed by the Pentagon, who admitted that the Treasury officials of Henry Morgenthau had pressed these severe terms of the directive upon them. The German people were now slaves of Henry Morgenthau and whoever fell under his authority or influence. As it turned out, after all, President Roosevelt had indeed agreed to the enslavement of the German people at Yalta. On top of this, there was already a slavery program in place. Flying in the face of all international law of any kind, the Allies were peddling German and Italian prisoners of war as literal slaves. The Americans had been selling Italian prisoners to Belgian coal mines. They demanded 5 marks per man, 5 marks per NCO, and 9 marks for each officer. Many Germans were sold to France, too, and conditions were so bad for these men that the Americans had to halt the slave trade until the French agreed to improve their conditions. In the Soviet zone, the slavery was beyond comprehension. Even in 1947, there was still 2.5 million German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union, and this isn't even taking into account the civilian slave labour which Roosevelt and Morgenthau had handed over to them. Most of these men wouldn't come back alive. They were literally worked to death in the Russian abyss. The British had even proposed selling their POWs, or rather slaves in this instance, to the Soviet Union in order to get better reparations terms. As part of an agreement by the British government, they would transfer millions of slaves to the Soviet Union, and in return, they would be rewarded £200 per head in the final reparations settlement. Later in the middle of the Nuremberg trials, the slavery of the German people was complete. In February 1946, the Allied Control Council established a new law in West Germany, which stated that all German males between 14 and 65, and all women between 15 and 50, were to be subjected to forced labour. If anyone refused to work, then their ration cards would be confiscated, and they would essentially starve to death. On the 8th of October 1945, Rudolf Hess, aged 52, arrived from his captivity in Britain. Hess, however, was a different man to the one he once was. He claimed to remember little except his own name, and had seemingly completely lost his mind, having been poisoned and drugged during his time as Churchill's personal prisoner. On the 9th, he sat down for his first interrogation with Colonel Arman. Here, he said that he knew his name, but was then asked, quote, "What was your last position?" End quote. Hess replied, quote, "Unfortunately, this already comes into a period which I cannot remember anymore. There are many cases where I can't even remember what happened 10 or 14 days ago." End quote. Arman grumbled and asked what period Hess could remember then, to which the former deputy Führer replied, quote, "Anything longer than, say, 14 days. It has frequently happened that I met gentlemen, and I could not even remember their faces when I saw them again. It is terrible. Yesterday I was told by a doctor, or maybe it was a clerk, over there, that it sometimes happened that people don't even know their own names anymore, and he said that perhaps a shock would suddenly bring it all back to me. This is terrible. Everything depends on it for me, because I shall have to defend myself in the coming trial." End quote. The exchange continued, and Hess was bombarded with questions over and over again, and each time he would simply reply that he did not remember. All he knew was that he was at a trial, and a political trial at that, because it was all anyone talked about. Eventually, he was asked, quote, "Do you know who Jews are?" End quote. Hess replied, quote, "Yes, they are a people, a race." Armin replied, "You didn't like them very well, did you?" To which Hess responded, "The Jews? No." Armin then said, "So you had some laws passed about the Jews, didn't you?" To which Hess bluntly parried, "If you say so." The interrogator was getting nowhere, and he then began to ask if he remembered Hitler, to which Hess said, quote, "Yes, during all that time I had a picture of him hanging in my room in front of me. The Führer was the leader. He was a personality who outshone everybody in every German's mind." End quote. That was all he remembered, and he did not remember working for him, or so he said. The interrogator then began to ramble through a list of names, none of which Hess claimed to remember. Goebbels, Keitel, Jodl, Lammers, all of them except one, that being Hermann Goering, who Hess said he remembered by name, but nothing much else. Quote, "If somebody were to come into this room right now, and you told me, 'Here is Goering,' I'd just say, 'Good day, Goering,'" end quote. This fruitless discussion continued for another 2 hours, before the interrogator headed off for lunch. Immediately afterwards, the talk continued, yet there was a man standing next to Hess this time, that being Hermann Goering. "Will you look over there to the right, to this gentleman here?" Armin said. Hess simply stared blankly at Goering. "Don't you know me?" Goering boomed. "We have been together for years." Hess replied, quote, "That must have been at the same time as that book they were showing me this morning. I have lost my memory for some time. Now of all times, before the trial." End quote. Goering gasped in disbelief and continued to question Hess. Quote, "Listen, Hess, I was the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe. You flew to Britain in one of my planes. Don't you remember that I was made Reichsmarshal at a meeting of the Reichstag at which you were present?" End quote. Hess, remaining in character, lamented, quote, "This is terrible. If the doctors hadn't assured me time after time that my memory will return sometime, I should be driven to desperation." End quote. Goering then roared, quote, "Hess, think back to 1923. Don't you remember how we both attempted a putsch in Munich?" End quote. This discussion continued until Goering was dismissed, and Professor Karl Haushofer, Hess's mentor and great friend, was brought in. Immediately upon seeing the emaciated and broken Hess, Haushofer exclaimed, "Mein Gott." The professor told Hess that he had met his son, whom Hess had obviously not seen since his daring flight. Quote, "I saw your wife and your child, and they are well. May I shake your hand? Your boy is wonderful. He is 7 years old now. I have seen him." End quote. Tempting though it must have been for Hess to break character, he did not. He simply replied, quote, "In order to calm down an old friend, I can only assure you that the doctors tell me that my memory will all come back to me in time, and then I shall recognize an old friend again. I am terribly sorry." End quote. More and more men were then brought in, all of which Hess claimed not to recognize. Eventually, the interrogator had enough and simply marched the broken Hess back to his cell. Everyone seemed to be buying Hess's story. Jackson ordered outside psychiatrists with outstanding qualifications to be brought in to examine Hess and Robert Ley, who was also losing his mind and wasn't long for this world. On the 13th, Franz von Papen was asked by Jackson's assistant if he thought Hess's mind was really gone, to which the elderly former chancellor replied, quote, "It seems to be. I found him very changed, and his face too, that he didn't recognize any of these people, and the way he spoke, it must be insanity." End quote. Goering was once again brought in by Colonel Armin during another interrogation with Hess. This time, Goering lost his nerve, quote, "Now look here, Hess, it wasn't simple for me to come here and talk to you, because I have to concentrate. Do you remember the Führer?" End quote. Hess said he remembered what he looked like, but not what he sounded like. Goering boomed out, quote, "You refuse to remember. You refuse to want to remember." End quote. An entire hour passed with both Goering and Armin losing their patience with Hess, yet nothing changed. Hess refused to remember. A few days later the experts arrived, and they seemed to believe that Hess may well be a paranoid schizophrenic. There was talk of injecting him as part of a process that would bring his memory back, but there had been fatalities in the past from such a procedure, and the Allies considered it best not to mess with Hess, lest they give him more accusations to throw at them, as he already believed he had been poisoned by them in the past, and the British, indeed, had already jammed truth serum into him, to no effect. There was the problem of charging Hess at all. On the 29th of October, Jackson had sent Ulrich Lippmann of the US Army to ransack the Hess household, where Ilse Hess was still living. Inside, they found 60 boxes of Hess's private and official correspondence, but Jackson concluded that most of it would actually advance Hess's case, not that of the prosecution. Lippmann admitted, quote, "Frankly, I am rather impressed with the type of friends he had, and the manner in which he frowned upon favoritism, even in the cases of his own family," end quote. These documents, of course, weren't given to Hess's defense counsel, and the former deputy Führer had refused to appoint a lawyer anyway, and said that he didn't care less if the tribunal appointed one for him. On the 2nd of November, he was appointed one anyway, but Hess told the lawyer, quote, "that I regard the entire trial as a farce, that the judgment will be a foregone conclusion, and that I do not recognize the tribunal's authority," end quote. Later, the Americans tried a new, rather simple tactic to make Hess give up his act, or remember who he was. They sat him down and made him watch Triumph of the Will for 2 hours. 50 Americans and Russians watched Hess's face the entire movie, but he showed no signs of recognizing anything. He was sticking to the act. The Americans didn't give up. They then tried bringing in 2 of Hess's former secretaries, who had worked with him for 8 years before his flight to Scotland. This tactic went the same way as the rest. The trio talked happily enough, but Hess claimed to simply not remember them, and the girls lamented how badly they had been treated by the Americans. Hess cheekily replied, quote, "I've always said the Americans are riffraff," end quote. Soon after this, Colonel Arman once again completely lost it with Hess, and tried every cheap tactic in the book, over and over again, to try and catch out Hess in his lie. Hess, however, was far too quick-witted for that, and he successfully parried every attempt to catch him out. Arman exploded and shouted, "Take him out, and leave the girls," and Hess was marched out of the room, but not before breaking character and whispering to the girls, quote, "You can be proud of the fact that you are prisoners," end quote. He then told them not to expect him to write them, and Hess never did see them again. Regardless, the Americans, still, after all these months, had no luck. There was trouble with other defendants too, as often the Americans had no idea what was fact or what was fiction themselves. On one occasion, Dr. Robert Kempner tried one of his subversive techniques on Goering and claimed that Rudolf Diels, Goering's first Gestapo chief, and Erich Gritzbach, Goering's chief aide, had given evidence incriminating Goering in the Reichstag fire, to which Goering immediately began to laugh himself silly. Goering, of course, had done no such thing, and the two men knew that as well as anyone. This was the last trick Kempner dared to try on Hermann Goering. Milch was in trouble too. He had been brought in from England to testify against both Speer and Goering, yet he seemed to be doing the exact opposite. Milch, who was part Jewish, was especially detested by the Jewish members of the American delegation, and they saw him as a turncoat member of their own faith, or rather, race. He was threatened that if he did not start cooperating and giving evidence, then he too would be put on trial for war crimes. Milch protested that he hadn't done anything, yet the interrogator, who went by many names, either Englander, Evans, or Emery, said, quote, "That's peanuts. We can cook up a war crimes case against any German if we want to," end quote. The defendants and their lawyers had strong views regarding their opponents too. The lawyers, whom the Allies looked at as Nazis themselves simply for being German, were nothing of the sort, quite the opposite in fact. Despite this, the Americans especially made themselves greatly hated. Irving writes, quote, "The German lawyers had almost unanimous contempt for the Americans, more respect for the British, and an unspoken fear of the Russians. Jackson," said Keitel's attorney Dr. Nelter, "was not objective, but was vain and pig-headed, and impelled by a visceral hatred of everything German," end quote. As for the defendants, Julius Streicher noted, quote, "There wasn't one single Jew among the British, nothing but Jews among the Americans, and only one of the Russians. Twice a day, a uniformed female lieutenant, a Jewess, walks past and smirks into my cell as though to say, 'There he is, he's not getting away from us this time,' end quote." The Allies felt just as strongly about Streicher, yet they weren't actually sure how to hang him yet, considering he hadn't done that much wrong during the war years. They were determined, however, and they would duly find a way. On the 19th of October, the Germans officially became defendants as they were served their indictments. Many immediately cracked under the strain as reality set in. Speer felt his gamble had failed and wrote home about how he felt his life was at an end. More dramatically, Dr. Robert Ley, leader of the German Labour Front, who had transformed German society, completely cracked. He scattered suicide notes around his cell, tore rags from his clothing, and stuffed them in his mouth, then twisted an army towel around his neck until it was tight enough to strangle him to death. An awful death, indeed. The Americans then buried him outside in an unmarked grave. Inside his cell were hundreds of pages of demented writings. He had well and truly been driven insane by the conditions he had been put through. and Jackson ordered that these files never, ever be released. Others thought of suicide too, but dismissed it out of hand. Keitel wrote to his defense counsel on the 24th of October, quote, "Suicide. How often I have found myself seriously confronted with this as a possible way out, only to reject it, because, as suicides have always demonstrated, nothing is changed, and nothing bettered by such action." End quote. Goering said calmly of Lay's suicide, quote, "Dr. Lay was unstable. He would probably have broken at the trial. I'm not afraid of the soldiers. They'll behave themselves." End quote. Even the Pope wasn't happy with events. Judge Biddle had an audience with His Holiness, and he lamented that Robert Lay, one of his flock, had been driven to suicide by his treatment at the hands of his captors. He then asked that the others be given a fair trial, and he particularly mentioned Franz von Papen, another Catholic whose wife had been in touch with him. Basically everybody, even the US Army, hated the trials for their own reasons. Everybody except Jackson. And Jackson's trials, finally, after all this time, officially began at 10 a.m. on Tuesday the 20th of November 1945 at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. 20 of the surviving defendants were marched out into the third-floor courtroom, and Kaltenbrunner remained in his cell, too ill to attend. Outside the courtroom, American medium tanks flexed their muscle in an unnecessary display of military might amidst the rubble to guard against the mentally broken and starving population of Nuremberg. The defendants sat down in 2 rows in the docks. Goering held the most prominent spot, and next to him was sat Hess, who simply opened up a novel and ignored the proceedings. The two would get along glowingly, sat next to each other, both feeling that the trials were a big show. British artist Dame Laura Knight, who was present, wrote, quote, "His fingers are short and stubby, unlike Hess's long, slender fingers. As I notice when Goering helps him with his papers, it would seem Goering has considerable affection and sympathy for Hess." End quote. Stryker, meanwhile, sat down and stared around the room, scanning to see who was Jewish and who was not. He observed afterwards, mistakenly, quote, "Of the 2 Frenchmen, one is 100% a Jew. Whenever I look across at him, he gets uncomfortable and turns his yellow-skinned, black-haired head to one side or the other. For those who can see, there could not be the slightest doubt. There are more Jews and half-Jews in the courtroom than non-Jews. 3/4 of the journalists and nearly all of the translators, stenotypists, male and female, and other assorted helpers are members of the Jewish race. How they smirk and sneer at us defendants in the dock. You can read it in their faces. Now we've got the whole gang of them, and that Stryker is there too. Almighty God, praise be to Jehovah, and praised be our ancestral father Abraham." End quote. Stryker may have been watching the room, but the whole room was watching the defendants. 300 press and radio correspondents crowded into the courtroom for day 1, and every minute was recorded. After having their charges read out, Goering was asked how he pleaded. The Reichsmarshal seized the microphone and said, "Before I answer," before being cut off. He wasn't allowed a speech, and so muttered, "Not guilty," in the sense of the indictment. In his hand was a 1-page declaration of what he wished to say. It read, quote, "As Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, I assume political responsibility for my own acts. Although answerable for these acts only to the German people and to the German courts, I am nevertheless willing, without recognizing the jurisdiction of this tribunal, to provide it with explanations that are desired and to speak the whole truth. I do, however, refuse to accept responsibility for acts committed by others, acts of which I was unaware and of which I would not have approved or been able to prevent if I had known of them. Hermann Goering." End quote. Next was Hess, who sprung to his feet and shouted, "9," to which the hundreds of spectators in the courtroom began to roar with laughter. Jackson was furious, feeling that Hess had stolen the show, which he indeed had. On the 29th, the court was once again in fits of laughter, but this time it was due to Goering, as his cheeky telephone conversations were read out with Ribbentrop, who was ambassador to Great Britain at the time. This put Goering in a boisterous mood, and he felt like he ruled the show, but he quickly shut up again, as Jackson countered by showing the first tape prepared by the OSS and his staff, showing grueling scenes from the concentration camps. The defendants knew they were finished, as any public sympathy for them was utterly dashed by these well-put-together films. One of the American lawyers watched the defendants as the film played. Quote, "Schacht and Fritsch refused to look at the screen at all and turned their heads away. All the rest seemed to have their eyes riveted to it. I wish every school child and adult could be made once a year on VE Day to see this film, and a few others at all the theatres in the US, to remind them that the Germans are dangerous and that the US should remain well armed and well manned. Also will be shown some captured German films of the Warsaw Ghetto, which the Germans obviously staged to use as propaganda purposes among the German people, to show what degraded and ugly subhumans the Jews are, which of course makes the film even more diabolical than if it were not so staged." End quote. During the showing of the film, Hess turned to Goering and said loudly, "I don't believe it," to which Goering told him to be quiet. Jodl wrote afterwards, quote, "These facts are the most frightful legacy left behind by the National Socialist regime. They are far worse than the destruction of Germany's cities. The ruins can be regarded as the honourable scars of a nation struggling for its existence. This, however, disgraces both the Wehrmacht and its commanders alike. I have already set out how methodically we have all been duped in this regard. The allegation that we all knew these things were going on is wrong. I would not have tolerated knowing of such things for one single day." End quote. On the last day of November, the tribunal went into closed session to hear the arguments on whether Rudolf Hess was fit to stand trial. The general belief was that he would be found incompetent to stand trial. Rudolf Hess, maybe, just maybe, might get to walk and be reunited with his dear wife Ilse and son, Wolf Rudiger, again, who had grown up without his father for almost 5 years now. As the other prisoners were returned to their cells, US Army psychiatrist Dr. Gilbert went to Hess and said to him, quote, "You may not be coming into this court anymore, but I'll come down and see you in your cell once in a while." End quote. Hess's expression suddenly turned to a worried frown. He knew he couldn't abandon his former colleagues, and he made a momentous decision that would cost him his freedom, and eventually his life. He replied to Dr. Gilbert with his lawyer present, quote, "I am perfectly competent to defend myself. I have decided to say that my memory has returned." End quote. After hours more of rambling on the topic in which Hess wasn't allowed to speak, he was finally given the opportunity. The emaciated-looking Hess stood up, made a curtsy towards the judges, and then read out the following, quote, "Mr. President, I should like to say this. In order that I may be allowed to continue to attend the trial and receive judgment alongside my colleagues as is my wish, and in order not to be declared unfit to plead, I submit the following declaration to the court. A declaration which I had not intended to make until a later point in the proceedings. From this time on, my memory is again at the disposal of the outside world. The reasons why I simulated amnesia are of a tactical nature. In fact, only my ability to concentrate is slightly impaired. On the other hand, my ability to follow the trial, to defend myself, to question witnesses, and to answer questions myself, these are not impaired. I emphasize that I assume full responsibility for everything that I have done, everything I have signed, and everything that I have co-signed. My deep-seated conviction that the tribunal has no competency is not affected by the above statement. I have successfully maintained the illusion of amnesia with my official defense counsel. He has acted accordingly in good faith." End quote. There was laughter from the public benches, and then the tribunal adjourned in uproar. In general, though, things weren't looking good for the defendants. Not even 2 weeks had passed, yet things looked impossible. The Germans had such a mountain to climb, and the procedure was so obviously stacked against them. The Germans entered proceedings with nothing at all. Most documents that would support their case had already been whisked away. In fact, the British had straight up stolen the Admiralty and Foreign Ministry files and taken them to London so they couldn't be used. They feared what was inside, especially when it came to Churchill's plans to invade Scandinavia. Kranzbühler observed, quote, "When the German defense attorneys arrived in Nuremberg in September 1945, they had literally nothing. The prosecution, on the other hand, had already seized all available archives and documents, and they were screening them with a huge army of experts for incriminating evidence." End quote. This was the idea. Jackson privately admitted that he didn't want a single one of the defendants getting off the hook. In a German court, this would have been not only unthinkable, but illegal. The general idea in German courts was to ascertain the truth, no matter what, and the German defense attorneys were completely taken aback by the confrontational style of Anglo-American trials. It was as if they were in a foreign land. The idea that one side would only present the evidence which benefited its own case was completely foreign. One egregious example of this was when an extract was quoted from a document showing Alfred Rosenberg reporting atrocious acts taking place in the occupied Eastern Territories. It was put in the context of him being responsible for these acts. Eventually, with great difficulty, the defense was able to show that the prosecution had deliberately left out the beginning of the document, which showed Rosenberg to be protesting against the atrocities he was describing. The Germans did have one advantage, however. This was of course that they spoke the language of the documents, and they were familiar with the events, as their clients were the ones who were actually there, whereas the Allies learned the facts themselves through sketchy translations and interpreters. To counter this, of course, the Allies simply didn't make anything useful available to the defense. On one occasion, they were forbidden to purchase a vital book currently for sale in Switzerland, written by the former Romanian foreign minister. On another occasion, the published war dispatch of the US Army Chief of Staff was denied to the defense lawyers because it proved that the Germans and Italians had not had a concerted plan with the Japanese before their attack on Pearl Harbor. There was also an instance where Goering's lawyer invited the Polish exile General Anders to supply evidence that the Russians themselves had murdered the Poles at Katyn, not the Germans. This is now common knowledge to us, and indeed, it was common knowledge to the prosecutors too, but to admit as much would sabotage the entire ordeal, and the blame was pinned on the Germans. General Anders was forbade to comply with Goering's request. Most embarrassingly of all, Hans Frank, who had handed over his entire 40-volume collection of diaries to the prosecutors on day one, was refused permission to see his own diaries or use them as evidence, despite the diaries being in the same building as them. On top of all this, the defense counsel was literally under attack. One of Neurath's lawyers was arrested and imprisoned for 6 weeks without being charged. Dr. Marks, who was assigned against his will to act as Streicher's attorney, was subjected to vicious press attacks, and his office was ransacked. He feared for his life and his liberty, and as a result tried to disassociate himself as much as possible from his client. There was also other foul play. Keitel was accused of involvement in the murder of a French general. SS Gruppenführer Hans Juttner was said to have acted on his orders. Dr. Nelter, Keitel's lawyer, quite rightly demanded Juttner to be called as a witness, but the Americans claimed they didn't know where he was. Nelter then said he would drive up the road to see Juttner immediately, and only then did the Americans admit that Juttner had been interrogated months beforehand and had confirmed that he had never received any order whatever from Keitel relating to this matter. The same thing happened with one of Jodel's key witnesses. Jodel set out to prove that the British had plans to invade neutral Norway, and in this regard, they contacted Colonel Saltman of the KOW's intelligence branch, who was extremely familiar with the matter in 1940. Saltman stated that he would happily testify, and then was immediately arrested by the Americans. Other witnesses had it worse. Irving writes, quote, "Those defense witnesses that did arrive at Nuremberg were softened up by the prosecution interrogators before being turned over to the defense. Some ended up in solitary confinement in the prison wing. SS Obergruppenführer Wolf, who volunteered to defend Kaltenbrunner in the SS, was whisked away by the Americans to a lunatic asylum, until, summoned to give evidence at a subsequent trial a year later, he was able to establish his sanity and released on the trial judge's orders to a normal prison. A further embarrassment was that Wolf alleged that Alan Dulles had promised him immunity in return for negotiating the surrender of the Axis forces in Italy in April 1945. Field Marshal Milch, who ignored the blackmail attempts of the American interrogator Englander and gave evidence in defense of Speer and Goering, would be immediately removed to the notorious punishment bunker at Dachau concentration camp." End quote. All in all, it was a hard task for the defense lawyers. Keitel's lawyer, Dr. Nelter, wrote, quote, "The trial effort being mounted by the victors is colossal. The evidence that has been amassed by the prosecution is a crippling burden for us, because we have no documents of comparable quality on the German side to put in against them. All we can do is try to piece together opposing evidence by an intricate process of mosaic work." End quote. Streicher too lamented, quote, "The usual court practice is that a defendant can challenge a judge for lack of impartiality. That would be the case if, for instance, the judge was related to a trial adversary. In this show trial, the victors are the prosecutors, and the judges are the vanquished and inevitably prejudiced. Because they are fully aware of this, they have laid down an appropriate rule, denying to the defendants in advance the opportunity of challenging them, and that is the purpose of this whole farce. In this trial there is no question of according to the defendant a blind and impartial justice. The trial has been set the task of giving to an injustice a veneer of legality by cloaking it in the language of the law." End quote. Meanwhile, back home the press had been whipping up a storm about the proceedings, and the public was baying for blood. One New York merchant, Ernst Schoenfeld, wrote a letter to Jackson, begging, quote, "If it would be permissible, if and when Julius Streicher is doomed to die, my most ardent wish would be to not only witness his execution, but to participate in it." End quote. The man then offered to pay his own round-trip expenses and offered Jackson a large sum of money. Jackson, quite rightly of course, chose not to reply. On the 20th of December, the proceedings broke up for Christmas, and the prisoners headed back off to their solitary confinement to sit and wait out the new year. All Red Cross parcels to the starving prisoners had been intercepted, and very few, if any, letters reached most of the prisoners. Goering, for example, wrote angrily they had only received 3 letters from his wife Emmy and his darling little Edda. This was expressly against his agreement when he had been arrested. General Patch of the US Army had expressly promised Goering that he would care for his family at Weldenstein Castle, his family castle north of Nuremberg. Quite the opposite ended up happening in reality. In mid-October, Goering's wife, who of course hadn't put a foot wrong, was arbitrarily arrested and thrown into Straubing prison, which was officially a civilian internment camp, which sounded awfully like what the Germans themselves were being prosecuted for. Worst of all, Edda had been stolen from her mother and thrown into an orphanage. She was only 7 years old. Even Emmy's niece, sister, and nurse had been arbitrarily arrested too. The same process happened with the other prisoners. Their women were locked up, and their children were thrown into foster care. Hans Frank's sister was one victim, and he wrote a letter to Judge Jackson, which was simply confiscated and never reached him. Quote, "My sister is completely innocent of any involvement in the accusations leveled against me. She has never been politically active and was not even a member of the Nazi Party. Please be so good as to attend to this case. God will reward you." End quote. Baldur von Schirach, the half-American Hitler Youth leader, had been ready to denounce the entire Nazi ideology and Adolf Hitler, but that all changed when his children were suddenly taken away from his wife, and then she too was arrested, and would later end up divorcing him. His attitude now fiercely hardened against the Americans. This was a common theme with all the prisoners. They feared the Russians, they had a deep respect for the British, despite all they had done to their beloved cities, but they all swiftly learned to hate the Americans. The French, by now a rather insignificant part of the proceedings, or Europe at large, were just seen as the junior partner of the British, and barely mentioned. Even Andras, the strict commandant of Nuremberg prison, was livid at these arbitrary arrests, and demanded that the women and children be released. He simply could not understand it. Quote, "Otherwise, during progress of the defence, testimony would be offered in the trial which would place the Americans on the defensive." End quote. Dr. Gilbert, the Jewish doctor, who the prisoners actually quite liked, overheard Goering telling the others, quote, "You see, they are just as bad as the Gestapo themselves. Don't let them pretend they are democratic. The Americans are still our enemies. What have women and children got to do with this?" End quote. It should be noted that Gilbert was actually just a spy for the prosecution, and he simply took whatever he had learned from the prisoners, which he had promised to keep confidential, to the prosecutors. Regardless, Goering led the charge in stiffening the prisoners' resolve and making sure they didn't just capitulate to the Americans' psychological warfare. He hated the Americans more than anyone in the dock, and it was he who managed to convince even von Schirach, the half-American, that the Americans were far worse than themselves. There was one American that the Germans certainly loved, however, and that was Pastor Henry F. Jericho. His visits were adored by the prisoners, and he was a genuinely good man with nothing but their best interests at heart, whom we'll look at in more detail in the next video. For now, however, the army relented and let Jericho visit Goering's wife on his behalf, and it meant the world to Hermann. He was able to get a letter to her via the pastor. Quote, "Now I am feeling calmer. It's obvious why you're all in custody, just because you are mine. As the Führer is dead, I am the #1 principal war criminal, and you are my relatives. The hatred and the thirst for revenge, you can imagine whose, are boundless, but I am not going to let them bend or break me. How often I go to you in my thoughts and try to imagine the life you are leading. Have you enough books? My treasure, I cannot express how much I love you. You and Edda have always been my pride and joy. I am filled with gratitude to you both." End quote. In another letter, he wrote, quote, "Day and night, 2 eyes stare at me through the porthole in the cell door. A spotlight shines on me all night. Your letters are the only sunshine in my life." End quote. The proceedings reopened on the 2nd of January, and things immediately got off to a terrible start for the defendants. SS Obergruppenführer Otto Ohlendorf testified to the mass shooting of Jews, which he himself had directed in the East. Worse was yet to come, as Ohlendorf was a friend of Speer's, and the two had a little trick to play. Speer's defense lawyer rose to his feet and asked Ohlendorf if he was aware of Speer's plan to assassinate Hitler in 1945. Goering immediately figured out what Speer was up to, and he spluttered with rage and stormed over to Speer as soon as the court adjourned, but the former armaments minister simply turned away from the Reichsmarshal. Speer was shameless in his lies to get off. He admitted to his wife when the trial ended, quote, "Most of the other defendants made things as tough as they could for me after they had heard details of my activities in the final phase of the war. It wasn't hard to imagine what they would have done if they had found out about them before the war was over. There wouldn't have been much of my family left." End quote. This, of course, was fiction. When the tribunal demanded to hear details of this secret plot to kill Hitler, Speer kept insisting that he didn't wish to go into detail, but they continued to demand, so he did so. Quote, "I am divulging these details only with the utmost reluctance, because there is a lot that is unattractive about such things. I am going to do so only because the tribunal insists. It is not my intention that my own case should profit from this episode." End quote. Goering raged to Dr. Gilbert afterwards, quote, "God in heaven, I nearly died of shame. To think that a German could be so rotten, just to prolong his wretched life. To put it crudely, to piss in front and crap behind a little longer. Herrgott, Donnerwetter. For myself, I couldn't care if I get executed, but there is still such a thing as honour." End quote. Goering made other friends amongst the Americans except the doctor and the pastor. One was a Texan lieutenant named Jack G. Wheelis. The two of them found they had much in common, including a love of the outdoors and hunting. Wheelis's friendship would come in handy later. Back in the dock, Dönitz was fighting for his life, and rightly so. Dönitz had offered up his files upon his arrest, and the British and American experts found him virtually blameless of any wrongdoing, but regardless, he was indicted. On top of this, Allied military circles found his case to be ridiculous, and they wanted him to get off. His time as Grand Admiral and before that as commander of the submarine fleet had been essentially as clean as could be. Others, however, were determined to see him hung. There were some very strange scenes indeed during the interrogation of Dönitz's chief of staff, Admiral Eberhard Göde, and his staff officer, Fregatenkapitan Hessler. The result was, quote, both men categorically denied that Dönitz ever countenanced the killing of survivors in cold blood, end quote. This was not the result the interrogators wanted. An American army captain of Czech origin who used the name Dr. Korda had been the one who interrogated Göde. When Göde refused to testify against Dönitz as he had done nothing wrong, Korda replied, quote, think about it, if you would. We've got so much against you that things could get quite nasty for you too. Your situation is extremely simple. Either you testify against Dönitz, and then we'll leave you in peace, or you don't, and then we'll string you up alongside Dönitz, end quote. Later on, the Allied War Crimes Commission had confronted Göde and bluntly asked him, quote, are you willing to testify against Dönitz, yes or no, end quote. He refused once more. They left Göde with the words, quote, you're going to regret this, end quote. These same efforts were used against the submarine crews in captivity. Of these men, only one man broke and said that Dönitz had, orally, given instructions to machine gun lifeboats, which of course went against all the documentary evidence that Dönitz has handed over to the Allies, as well as the testimony of every other officer in the submarine arm, even during duress. In court, Dönitz came off clean as a whistle, and his defence greatly impressed the court. His attempt at using tu quoque, or you did it too, was actually accepted. The British themselves had machine gunned the unarmed German seamen fleeing from the Altmark in 1940, and the drowning seamen fleeing from the minesweeper Alm in 1942. By comparison, Dönitz's U-boat war came off as clean as could be, and he was duly exonerated of his conduct of submarine warfare. Instead, he was convicted of having failed to question Hitler's order for the execution of Allied saboteurs and commandos, which the Fuhrer had put into place after German prisoners were brutalised during a British commando raid on Sark. Later on, an endless stream of Allied naval officers wrote to Admiral Dönitz and disowned the tribunal's verdict. Also relating to naval matters was the invasion of Norway, which the defendants knew the truth about. In March 1946, Field Marshal Keitel's lawyers demanded that the British produce Churchill's identical plans to invade neutral Scandinavia. Back home in Britain, this caused a panic, and Cabinet Secretary Sir Norman Brooke bluntly stated to the Foreign Office that the claim was true. It would, quote, be supported by documents captured by the Germans in France, including records of the meeting of the Supreme War Council, end quote. Essentially, the Brits admitted that their plans to invade Norway were very much real, and were what had caused the Germans to rush to beat them to the punch. The Brits tried every trick in the book to prevent these documents being produced at Nuremberg. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin was completely opposed, quote, if we once begin, it might be very difficult to know where we could call a halt, as one telegram refers to another, and we might bring up embarrassing references to the Finnish phase of our war plans. It would be very much better not to be drawn in at all into the business of establishing arguments by the production of documents, especially when we don't know precisely what captured documents the other side may have, end quote. And so it went. The Russians weren't to find out that the Brits were planning to join Finland in their war against Russia, and the Germans weren't allowed to prove that the Brits were going to invade neutral Norway and Sweden first. Keitel and Jodl were deprived of vital evidence, which would have very much helped their cases. There was trouble for Keitel and other defendants in the same vein too. Irving explains, quote, Holder, who had been the chief of Hitler's general staff until his dismissal in September 1942, was acting although he had always been an opponent of the Fuhrer, and he expressed an unseemly eagerness to testify in the witness box against his real enemy, Field Marshal Keitel, the former chief of the OKV. When Keitel's lawyer, Dr. Otto Nelter, heard of this, he used two letters which he threatened to introduce in evidence, in which Holder had expressed himself in glowing language about their Fuhrer, to dissuade the general from testifying against Keitel. In fact, it is now plain that Holder's general staff, and not Keitel and the OKV, had made the running in such criminal enterprises as initiating the attack on Russia, and drafting the order of the liquidation of Soviet commissars. Nelter's warning was typical of the behind-the-scenes manoeuvring that went on at Nuremberg. In another such deal, Papin's lawyer, Dr. Egon Kubashok, was able to persuade the Americans to withdraw on threatened witnesses against his client, in return for withdrawing one of his own, who would have damaged the American case against other defendants. Such bargains were unknown under German law, end quote. Goering was in big trouble too. Birger Delaris, a Swedish businessman, had acted as a go-between as Goering desperately tried to avert war between Britain and Germany in 1939, and then later, Goering had tried this same avenue to bring about a peace. Goering, too, was staunchly against war with the Soviet Union, and had argued this case relentlessly against the Fuhrer. Delaris, however, was threatened and blackmailed into silence by the British government in 1943, and his memoirs were cleverly pruned before they were allowed to be published. The memoirs were brought in as evidence, but to Goering's shock, as mentioned, they had been thoroughly cleaned up. One man, very different to the rest, who resigned himself to his fate without any schemes or drama, was Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Gilbert called him a brilliant and cultured intellectual with an IQ of 141. Arthur frankly admitted that his activities as the governor of the Netherlands were, quote, enough to hang him. Despite him saying he made his best efforts at setting up a benevolent administration there, he knew he was going to hang, and so he waited until that fateful day, keeping himself out of trouble. Hans Fritsch, Goebbels' chief radio propagandist, was quite the opposite, and he collapsed. He claimed that during the war, whenever he heard of enemy propaganda broadcasts regarding German atrocities, he would ask the SS and Gestapo about the truth of the matter, each and every time he was given assurances that the Allies were lying. Gilbert writes, quote, now, seeing the evidence in court, he has every time shown signs of emotional collapse, and recently had to be kept out of court for one day for that reason, end quote. The most important prisoner except Goering, however, was Speer. He held the key to the fate of every other prisoner, and he was willing to sing like a canary. Gilbert wrote a full profile on him. Quote, A. Character description. Though essentially a materialist with a lack of social sophistication and imagination, he shows a certain amount of intellectual honesty and moral courage, IQ 127. B. Trial attitude and defense. He is the only one who maintained from the very beginning that the Nazi leaders, including himself, share a common guilt for supporting a policy that resulted in destruction and murder. However innocent his own motives may have been, his own guilt lies in his blind faith in Hitler until he realized what a destructive maniac he was. Too late to do much good. He will admit his own guilt and proceed to show how guilty the administration was within his sphere of activity. He has prepared questions for his witnesses to show that war production violated 70 points of law and will produce other incriminating evidence. He will then reveal how he plotted to assassinate Hitler and to deliver Bormann, Himmler, Goering and Keitel into Allied hands. His justification will be the destructive mania that Hitler exhibited after the war was obviously lost, and he appealed to Hitler to quit in January 1945. At that time, Hitler told him that if the German people couldn't win the war, they didn't deserve to exist. He documented this fact and his opposition to Hitler and will produce the evidence if permitted. There will be no need to cross-examine him on his personal defense, but he can be brought to give damaging evidence against Goering, Keitel, and the Nazi leadership in general. He will testify that Hitler considered Schacht an opponent against his aggressive plans, however. Among other things, he has expressed his expert opinion that as a result of Hitler's prolongation of the war, Germany would be lucky to survive on a mere subsistence level for 10 years, and need not blame the occupation army for her plight. He is anxious to avoid the impression of saying these things to save his neck, and will freely admit his share of the common responsibility because he had Hitler's confidence and did not use it to avert the catastrophe soon enough. His bitterness can be understood in terms of the destruction of his architecture and the betrayal of his blind faith by a destructive maniac. End quote. On the 24th of February, Judge Biddle wrote, quote, the most interesting part of the trial has begun. Goering should be on in a week or 10 days, then Hess, Keitel, Ribbentrop, etc. End quote. Behind the scenes, however, there were issues. Each defendant should have been allowed 1 week, and if that was the case, then the trials would run for another 5 months before rebuttals even began. The judges and their gigantic teams began to grow restless and started to fall out with each other now that the realization that they would be away from home for many more months began to set in. Judge Biddle, however, said optimistically that the defense might at any moment collapse if they felt that the evidence was hurting their case, which, so far, it is, he said. The next day, Hermann Goering was to take the stand. The Reichsmarshal had his own plans, and he welcomed the dragging out of the trial. He realized that the longer things went on, the higher the chance was of the four powers falling out with each other, or rather, the other three falling out with the Soviets. Behind the scenes, the sneaky Dr. Gilbert had given Jackson a full character profile of Goering in preparation for the Reichsmarshal taking the stand. Dr. Gilbert had by now grown rather sick of Goering, as he was running rings around him during their discussions. On one occasion, Gilbert muttered something about aggressive wars of imperial conquest, to which Goering responded, quote, "Don't make me laugh. America, England and Russia have all done the same thing to promote their own national aspirations, but when Germany does it, it becomes a crime because we lost." End quote. Goering's strategy, going into his defense, was to be that he had been staunchly against both the war with Britain and the war with the Soviet Union. The latter, he stated, was premature but inevitable sooner or later. During his discussions with Gilbert, Goering had spoken about his plans. On the topic of atrocities, he simply denied them and said that he certainly had not ordered any, and quote, "Were not the Russians the real experts in mass murder?" End quote. He also told the doctor that he had proof that the Soviets had been the ones behind the atrocities they were accusing the Germans of, like the one at Katyn. As for the charge that Goering had got fabulously rich from the war when it came to his art treasures, he simply said that he had brought them legally and had the receipts to prove it. Indeed, in many cases, Goering was actually ripped off and paid well over the odds, as it turned out. Dr. Gilbert took this to Jackson and said, quote, "Goering should be asked how he acquired art amounting to billions of marks from all countries, why he did not investigate atrocity reports, whether he considered the lives of millions of Germans in preparing for war." End quote. A week or so before it was Goering's turn, Dr. Gilbert recommended that the prisoners be seated differently during lunchtime so they couldn't communicate effectively, and this was indeed implemented. Goering was put on a table with Stryker so they could no longer influence the other prisoners. Being the extreme extrovert that he was, Goering immediately became dejected and vowed revenge on Colonel Andrus, the prison commandant who had enacted this new arrangement. Soon enough, it was showtime. Goering, by now, had gone through months of demoralization and starvation, and he had gone from £264 to 186. He truly was a new man at the age of 53. Despite all of this, Goering was a man on a mission. The harsh treatment he had undergone had only hardened his resolve, and he had plotted revenge whilst the judges themselves had been partying it up and living a life of luxury outside the jailhouse walls amidst Goering's starving countrymen. On the 10th of March, Goering's witnesses stepped up. General Karl Bodenschatz, the first, was torn to pieces by Jackson. Goering said to Gilbert afterwards, "Just wait till he starts on me." Next up was Milch, Goering's old enemy. Milch had been expressly brought here to testify against the defendants, not for them. Yet when he got to the stand, he spoke up entirely in defense of his former Reichsmarshal, friend, enemy, and colleague. It had been a troubled relationship. The Americans, watching in disbelief, were absolutely seething with rage. Milch wrote afterwards, quote, "Sworn in, everybody wearing earphones. Then, examination by attorney Starmer. When I was asked about Goering's attitude to prisoners of war, Jackson interrupted. We've shown enough patience, but this is going too far. I object. The tribunal sustained his objection, and poor Starmer, somewhat confused, asked me one more short question and sat down." End quote. The Americans weren't going to let the Germans get their way that easily. Milch recorded, quote, "The defendants were mostly very crushed. When I saw Jodl being led away, his eyes were filled with tears." End quote. On the 11th, Milch was in what the press called a battle of wits with Jackson for 5 hours, but part of this just consisted of Jackson trying to prove that Milch was half Jewish, which he was, but Milch denied such an allegation, and it turned into a pointless rambling fest. Milch read out the newspaper report mentioned earlier and said, quote, "I must have knocked their plans into a cocked hat." End quote. The article read, quote, "Unless means is found of keeping witnesses to the point, the Nuremberg trials will become an opportunity for Nazi polemics and false trials." End quote. Jackson did not have a good go of it. During the battle, Jackson asked Milch his thoughts on air attacks against civilians. Milch proudly replied, quote, "I can think of nothing crueler and more objectionable than such air raids. Anybody who still has any doubts has only to take a look at Hamburg, Berlin, Leipzig, the Ruhr cities, and particularly Dresden to see what I mean." End quote. This daring quote was actually removed from the transcripts. Milch himself had to protest years later for it to be added in. Much of the other 17,000 pages of the transcript was all over the place, with inaccuracies and exclusions in favour of the prosecutors as well. This happened more than once. On another occasion, the following showdown was removed. Jackson said to Milch, quote, "Did you know that Speer turned over to the United States all his personal papers and lists, including the minutes of the Central Planning Committee?" End quote. Milch replied, quote, "That is a matter of indifference to me." End quote. Jackson immediately snapped back, quote, "That will not be indifferent to you." End quote. Later, Milch spoke about his internment, which was against international law, and he said after his capture he was, quote, "beaten about the head." End quote. Milch was having a field day. The British Assistant Prosecutor, G.D. Roberts, said, quote, "You are of course aware that Norway's neutrality was violated." End quote. Milch, in typical form, replied in reference to the British violation at the exact same time, quote, "Jawohl, to our knowledge and in our view, it was violated twice." End quote. The Americans, furious at this absolute show that Milch had put on, got their revenge by taking Milch and placing him in the notorious punishment bunker at Dachau concentration camp. Yes, you heard that correctly. Here, Milch was cramped into a one-man cell with a whole crowd of other Germans. At Dachau, now under Allied command, the prisoners were known as live bodies instead of people. Here, Milch, Dr. Karl Brandt, General von Falkenhausen, General von Falkenhorst, and Field Marshal Sprell, amongst others, would simply rot away, starving to death in the most squalid conditions possible. The Red Cross heard rumours and began to investigate until the American hangmen began to turn these live bodies into dead ones in many cases. Milch, however, was just the start for Jackson. He wrote a few days after Milch's departure, quote, "Everything had gone pretty well with the trial until Goering took the witness stand. That, we knew, would be our hard fight. The press have been playing him up as a buffoon, but of course, he really is an extremely tough and sophisticated person," end quote. Irving writes of the scene that followed, for which nobody was prepared. Quote, "Goering was in no doubt about his own probable fate, and he did not seek to ameliorate it. Rather die like a lion than frisk like a rabbit," he would tell his own lawyers. Taking his seat late in the dock one morning, he apologised loudly to the lawyers' tables that he had been delayed by a blood test. "They'll be drawing enough blood from me pretty soon," he added jocularly. He expected to go before a firing squad. Viewing the courtroom from the bench, Sir Norman Burkitt realised that Goering was dominating the entire proceedings. He had followed the evidence intently when required to, and he had slept like a baby when not. Nobody, the Englishman added, seemed to have been quite prepared for Goering's immense ability and knowledge, or for his mastery of the captured documents. As Goering now began to speak from the witness stand on Wednesday, March the 13th, the whole building was packed. The Lion was not only fighting back, he erupted in glistening oratory, embellishing his answers with a ready humour that evoked gales of laughter from the public galleries. He hoped that somewhere out there in the forest surrounding the city, his wife and little girl were proud witnesses to this, his last stand. Millions of radio listeners around the world listened to the performance. In prison camps in Britain, across liberated Europe, and in America, the men poured out into the open to cluster around the loudspeakers as Hermann's unmistakable voice echoed around their Quonset and Nissen huts. Former German prisoners of war have admitted to this author that they stood up and cheered, enthralled at the audio spectacle of the Reichsmarshal fighting back for Germany. One Luftwaffe doctor who collected and digested the sparse news reports of fellow Luftwaffe officers interned at Latimer in Buckinghamshire observed that Goering won back much of his lost prestige at the interrogation centre on this day. The Allied and licensed German journalists crowding the press tables in the courthouse building at Nuremberg were speechless, having, as Jackson rightly noted, believed their own news stories that the Reichsmarshal was a dope fiend, a physical wreck, and a neurotic. His first day was a triumph. For the prosecution, it produced a debacle which threatened to mismantle the whole edifice that Jackson and his colleagues had painstakingly laboured to erect. Smoking his long meerschaum pipe afterwards, the Reichsmarshal sat on the cot in his cell and stretched out an arm for Dr. Gilbert to see. It was as steady as a rock, end quote. One man in the defence was furious at Goering's grand show, and that was Speer. He admitted that he hoped Jackson would show him up in the next week's cross-examination. Here too he would be disappointed. On Monday the 18th of March, the same thing happened again. Sir Norman Burkitt wrote in his notes, quote, "The cross-examination had not proceeded more than 10 minutes before it was seen that he was a complete master of Justice Jackson. Suave, shrewd, adroit, capable, resourceful, he quickly saw the elements of the situation, and, as his confidence grew, his mastery became more apparent. For almost 2 days, he held the stage without interruption of any kind," end quote. Jackson threw charge after charge at Goering, and the Reichsmarshal did not deny them. Instead, he stated that he was proud of having destroyed the Weimar Republic and of suppressing parliamentary opposition. It seemed even Jackson's own side was against him. During a long tirade from Goering, Jackson ordered him to simply answer yes or no. Judge Biddle then leaned over to Lord Justice Lawrence and whispered something. Lawrence then whispered to Jackson, quote, "Mr. Justice Jackson, the tribunal feels that the witness should be allowed to make whatever explanation he cares to make in answer to this question," end quote. Goering glowed with joy, and his domination of the courtroom continued. This process went on for days. Irving writes, quote, "At each thrust and parry by Goering, he became more incensed. Like a bull enraged by the picadors, he continued to charge blindly in every direction. Here was a defendant who refused to abide by the rules of the sport, rules that seemed clearly defined by their very status. These were the victors, and those were the vanquished." Goering, however, had determined to ridicule Jackson and destroy his authority in this court, and his silver tongue and fearlessness about death were ready allies to that end. When Jackson, desperately trying to salvage something from a 1935 document, wrongly identified by his team as proof of Nazi planning for a remilitarization of the Rhineland 1 year before that event, pointed to the top secret classification on the paper, as though this were in itself a heinous offence, Goering scoffed insolently that he could not recall having seen the secret plans of the US Joint Chief of Staffs openly published in the pre-war years. There was raucous laughter from all over the court. Jackson ripped off his headphones and threw them down, then petulantly appealed to the judges to call the witness to order. He must answer the questions and not attempt to deliver lengthy and irrelevant speeches. Lawrence ruled that Goering's answer was in order, end quote. At that night's secret meeting of the chief prosecutors, Jackson was livid. Quote, "The arrogance of Goering in today's session supports what opponents of this trial have always said. If you give these people a chance to speak, they will propagandize and make it a farce." When I objected to Goering's attitude and requested the court to instruct him to answer responsively, Judge Biddle whispered in the ear of the presiding judge, and thereupon the court overruled me on its own motion without even hearing an objection from Goering's counsel. If Goering is permitted to get away with this, he will encourage all the defendants to do the same thing. I have never heard of such a rule for cross-examination. The witness should be compelled to answer the question and to reserve his explanations for later. It is utterly impossible to cross-examine unless the court controls the witnesses, and Goering knows he has the court in his corner, end quote. After this, Jackson proposed to abandon the cross-examination of Goering altogether. Maxwell Fyfe, the British prosecutor, reacted with horror. Quote, "To cease now would be interpreted as a victory for Goering's obstructive tactics," end quote. As is clear, Goering was in Jackson's head a little bit, to say the least. The worst comment was yet to come. He said in an outburst, quote, "Goering is permitted to become a hero of the Nazis because he dares to talk back to the United States. This wins him admiration from all the Nazis who remain in Germany, and he will influence the other defendants to do likewise. I almost felt this afternoon that it would have been wiser to have shot these men out of hand," end quote. When it was Goering's turn with Maxwell Fyfe, however, the whole show wound down, and Fyfe was able to get Goering sweating and on the defensive for a while. Regardless, the damage was done. The prosecutors were falling out with each other. Judge Biddle, when looking for a new billet, made sure to avoid being too close to Jackson, and the two absolutely hated each other by now. Jackson, on the other hand, would privately blame Biddle for the Goering affair, and said that it was due to the, quote, "ineptitude and malice of a pissant like Biddle," end quote. Jackson's son wrote, quote, "The trial is not going well, thanks chiefly to Francis Biddle, who has replaced Donovan as the first-class son of a bitch. He is insanely jealous of father, and has gone out of his way to get him. It all began with his jealousy of the fact that father had a bigger car, bigger office, bigger house, etc. Also, it is true that he is a bigger man, and that galled Biddle, who wanted to be number one and get all the publicity," end quote. As for the German public, they were now well behind their former Reichsmarshal, and mail, which obviously didn't reach him, poured into the Nuremberg courthouse. Messages such as, "Keep your chin up, Herman," and "Good for you, Herman," with a common theme. Most importantly though, a letter came in for Herman from his daughter, with a flower pressed into it. Quote, "Mummy was sad she didn't hear you on the radio. I would have given up all my toys just to hear your voice. Mummy has told me she's going to be allowed to see you. I'd like to see you frightfully too. Can't I come as well? I'm so fond of you, and it's so awfully long since I saw you. Oh, Papa, if only I could come too. I promise you, Papa, that I always try to comfort Mummy, and I'll always protect her. How much nicer it would be if you were there to protect us. I pray every evening to dear God that Mummy and I can see you soon and give you a big hug," end quote. Hermann Goering had now set a precedent. As Sir Norman Burkitt was to admit, if the rest of the defendants acted the same way that their Reichsmarshal did, then the trial would have been reduced to an utter shambles and embarrassed before the world. The issue was, however, that not all of these defendants viewed the trial the same way Goering did. He knew he was going to be put to death no matter what. Speer and Schacht, however, were willing to do whatever it took to get off. Both of them began to pile dirt onto Goering in their evidence, and when Goering heard of this, he was livid. He passed word to Jackson saying that if he was guaranteed an honourable death by a firing squad, then he would give the prosecution some real dirt on Schacht. Schacht drew the ire of his fellow defendants too, as they watched him try to throw Goering under the bus. Keitel told his son a few weeks later, quote, "Schacht made a poor impression. He thinks he's the brightest defendant of the lot. Sometimes he was completely unpolitical, and sometimes just an economist," end quote. Schacht's biggest act of treachery was yet to come. He called Hans Gisevius, a renegade Abwehr officer, to come and give evidence on his behalf. Gisevius was simply an American puppet, and his OSS handler was none other than Alan Dulles, who in a few years' time would become the head of the CIA until he was fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs invasion. On the face of it, such an act would be perfectly normal, as Schacht had supposedly been involved in anti-Hitler plots. The issue, however, was that Gisevius wasn't really there to support Schacht, or Frick, who also called him. Gisevius was there to sabotage Goering, and he played his role exactly as requested and arranged. Jackson sent a letter to Gisevius' handler, Dulles, afterwards, quote, "Gisevius fulfilled the expectations stated in your letters. Goering is in a bad state," end quote. Keitel, like most others, was furious. Gisevius began airing all sorts of dirty laundry, like the Blomberg affair, that had nothing to do with the case. Quote, Gisevius was a dirty character whom Canaris, who had been playing a double game from the very outbreak of war, sent into Switzerland with intelligence missions concerning Britain and America. When Nelter asked him how much the foreigners had paid him for his activities, Gisevius refused to answer. Almost to a man, the lawyers had risen in arms against Gisevius. End quote. This was by far the dirtiest trick so far, and Schacht, Jackson, and others were all in on it. Raeder, too, had fallen to treachery to save his own skin. Whilst in Russian captivity, he had written a scathing indictment of his fellow commanders-in-chief in order to save his own skin. Keitel especially was singled out. In May, the Russians tried to introduce the document, but the tribunal refused its application on a technicality. Keitel, however, was still devastated when he heard about it. Quote, I have seen my character so grievously smeared by a very senior representative of the armed forces that I can no longer expect to meet with any understanding from this tribunal, end quote. He also stated in the letter that Raeder had never voiced such criticisms during the war, and at the end of the letter, he offered his lawyer, Dr. Nelter, the chance to resign. The attorney, by now attached to his client and in it for the long run, for better or for worse, refused. Jodl, however, proved steadfast and stood by his man Keitel in the first week of June. He clearly and frankly said all the things that Keitel had been too flustered to say in his own defence. Keitel wrote to Jodl's wife afterwards, quote, I feel that I must and should write to tell you how delighted I have been with the course of the defence during this last week. Your husband's constancy and dignity, and the way he has preserved his honour as a soldier, were as impressive as his clear and irrefutable answers were convincing. The great effort you have made with your cooperation has also repaid itself 100-fold, end quote. During this time, Judge Jackson and his son went to Prague to get a glimpse of the Soviet proceedings against Karl Hermann Frank, the man accused of the massacre at Lidice. Jackson Jr. said that these courts were notorious for being, quote, drumhead affairs, end quote, which would, quote, give the defendant a fair trial and then hang him, end quote. His father wrote that this trial was, quote, a revelation in efficiency and fairness of trial procedure, end quote. Frank was sentenced and strangled to death swiftly afterwards. Jackson had another nightmare coming up soon. The case against Hjalmar Schacht was viewed by many as a joke, yet Jackson, essentially alone, viewed Schacht as one of the most serious offenders, and a despicable human being at that. Schacht had simply turned his back when the videos displaying the camps were shown in the courtroom, and the old wizard, as he called himself, was proudly boasting to his fellow defendants that he would be easily acquitted. Rumours also circulated that the prosecution of Schacht wasn't in earnest, and that he was only there to show fairness, aka he was only there to be let off so the proceedings seemed fair. Jackson, however, was out of his depth. Quote, he soon became aware that the Nazi banker did indeed have friends in the most unlikely places and influence everywhere. One day, one of his team, the eminent New York international lawyer, Ralph Albrecht, reported to him that the British Assistant Prosecutor, Colonel Harry J. Phillimore, later a Lord Justice of Appeal in London, had accosted him in the hall outside the courtroom and urged the Americans to relax their remorseless pressure on the banker. When Albrecht, perplexed, asked, why, Phillimore uneasily explained that certain representations had been made by Sir Montague Norman, Governor of the Bank of England from 1920 to 1944. It would be most unfortunate, murmured the British colonel, if anything were to happen to Schacht. In fact, Schacht had been an informer of Sir Montague, secretly apprising him of the political and financial decisions taken at the highest level in Berlin for 16 years before the war, end quote. On top of this, Phillimore, Schacht, Montague Norman, and Sir Norman Burkitt were all Freemasons. Jackson, too, was a leading Freemason who frequently wrote to President Truman, Grand Master of the Masons of Missouri, regarding their Masonry. It has been suggested by some that Schacht would only get acquitted due to his Masonic connections. Jackson had his own mind, and he pressed hard for Schacht to be convicted, but ultimately to no avail. The result, later in the proceedings of course, was the following, quote, all the more acute was Jackson's fury when the tribunal, with only the Russian judge publicly dissenting, acquitted Schacht. Biddle, who read out this part of the judgment, claimed some months later that he had also wanted to convict, but the British had insisted on an acquittal and had left him no choice, end quote. Soon enough, there was even more trouble for Jackson. Dr. Alfred Seidel, Rudolf Hess's and Hans Frank's lawyer, threatened to torpedo the entire proceedings by tossing the cat among the pigeons, as Irving puts it. In the same way that the British had gone to great efforts to conceal their plans for Norway, the Russians had gone to great lengths to keep their Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact contents a secret. Suddenly, however, Seidel applied to put the secret text of the pact before the court. He had received a top-secret document from an officer of the US, and he refused to say who specifically. Seidel read out the preamble of the secret protocol of the treaty, whilst Ribbentrop was being examined on the 1st of April, and the former foreign minister confirmed its authenticity. The Russians immediately protested, but they were overruled. Later, as it turned out, the US State Department themselves had planted this document in Seidel's hands, in what proved to be the opening shot of the Cold War. The issue was that Seidel only had a photocopy, which was neither sealed nor authenticated, which wouldn't have mattered if the roles were reversed, as the prosecutors had done the same thing with documents such as the Hossbach Protocol. Regardless, the Russians evaded and evaded. Seidel went to the Soviet prosecutor's office and asked them to attest to the document's authenticity. When the Soviet delegation was invited to verify them, General Zorya simply said, quote, "I am afraid this is a totally pointless conversation," end quote. Seidel continued to relentlessly push the document into the proceedings, and the Soviets were reeling as chaos erupted behind the scenes as they scrambled for a way to keep things secret. Eventually, in order to keep the peace, the prosecutors formed a united front. The document was rejected as a forgery, which of course it wasn't. On the very next day, the 22nd of May, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, a large American newspaper, published the authentic text of the secret document for the first time, revealing the lie to the world. The State Department had got their first shot off, with or without the trial. The next day, the 23rd, General Zorya was found dead in his office with a bullet in his head. Stalin, evidently, wasn't too happy that the Russians at Nuremberg had failed to keep his pact a secret. By the time Jackson returned from a little trip to Paris and London, however, it was time for Speer. Sir David Maxwell Fyfe recorded, quote, "My wife was one of the many people who were profoundly impressed by Speer's evidence and manner, and remarked to Griffith Jones that he would be the sort of man Germany would need in the future," end quote. This was the prevailing view of the prosecutors. Speer had completely and utterly given himself over to the Allies, and he was doing everything short of kneeling before them and announcing his servitude to them. He would do whatever he could to save his neck. Irving writes of the whole ordeal, quote, "History can now be in little doubt about the immensity of Speer's guilt, particularly for the use of slave labour in the underground missile plants, which mass-produced V-2 rocket missiles and the jet engines for the Messerschmitt 262 planes, and for the eviction of 50,000 Jews from their apartments in Berlin in pursuit of his slum clearance projects, which became the first stage of the expulsion of those Jews from Germany to uncertain fates in the Eastern Territories and at Auschwitz." In a desperate though smoothly executed attempt to save his neck, Speer rattled on his colleagues at Nuremberg. Private letters which he addressed to Jackson, penciled in the block letters prescribed by his jailers, had testified to his anxiety to do a deal with the Americans in preference to one of the other Allied powers. Thomas Dodd, initially assigned to conduct the interrogation of Speer, reported that the former architect's guiding emotions were vanity and jealousy of Goering. Since Speer obviously felt slighted by Jackson's decision to relegate his cross-examination to a subordinate, Dodd urged Jackson to recognise this foible and to tackle the Reich minister in person. "It will buck up Speer's morale," he said, "and make him feel important and turn him into a much more candid witness." This was a very accurate assessment of Speer's character. Jackson yielded to Dodd's advice and sent private word to Speer to that effect. Speer, as predicted, replied through the prisoner's grapevine that he was therefore now ready to spill the beans. He would write in his memoirs, "On the eve of the cross-examination, an American officer dashed into my cell to break it to me that Jackson had decided to take over my examination in person." In the witness box, Hitler's former friend and minister proceeded to reveal so much and was so emphatic in his denunciation of the Führer and of his fellow defendants that the American chief prosecutor was delighted. "He made a good witness for us," Jackson wrote after this cross-examination. Later, he would privately state, "If I had been picking one of the defendants for acquittal, I would have acquitted Speer," end quote. Speer, however, had made a serious mistake with this strategy. Speer had chosen to suck up to the Americans, but this was a trial in which there were 4 powers, not 1. In mid-June, the defendants had their revenge, and they dragged out their final statements for weeks on end, resulting in endless frustrating delays. Many of the defendants were fully aware that they stood no chance, so they may as well make it difficult, they thought. Jackson wrote angrily about what he called a filibuster against death. Quote, "I do not intend to sit and listen to them day after day," end quote. As it turned out, this delay ended up costing Jackson his position in the Supreme Court back home. The delays simply went on too long, and others back home were in a better position to influence events. The defendants, indirectly, had sabotaged Jackson's career. On the 27th of June 1946, the judges began deliberations on their final opinion behind closed doors. The results were out of touch in the extreme. Irving writes, quote, The intention was that these deliberations should forever remain secret, that the outside world should never discover what reasons led to the acquittal of these men and the hanging of those. Among the private papers of the American judge, Francis Biddle, are, however, his daily notes taken during these deliberations. It is astonishing, even rather horrifying, to see from them how far the judges were undecided, how they wavered, and how much they disagreed on the very simplest issues, how they wavered and vacillated up to the last moment, and how despite the weeks and months of hearings, they continued to nurse misconceptions for which there was no evidence at all. Their discussions reveal an almost unreal atmosphere, an unworldly detachment from the harsh realities of war and peace. At one stage, the British judge, of all people, felt that a defendant needed punishing for having called for the bombing of a town in England. Politics often overrode the requirements of law. Sentences had to be harsh. The tribunal was too important, said one judge, to award light sentences, end quote. As it turned out, the French tended to be the least harsh, whereas the Russians were by far the harshest, demanding death sentences all across the board on all counts. The Americans, too, were extremely harsh, and voted for the death penalty far more often than their Western colleagues. Things didn't turn out as simple as hoped for the prosecution, however, and they became bogged down over the nitty-gritty, over what the real message should be regarding the trials. Should wars of aggression be focused on, or rather a conspiracy? How about Hitler's seizure of power or the treatment of Jews? None of the parties could agree, and all had their own agenda. The Russians pushed obsessively for the latter, whereas the Americans seemed focused on making a big fuss about wars of aggression, which the other parties found silly, as of course, wars of aggression could well be fought for legal reasons in their eyes. The biggest issue was that of conspiracy, as if this charge was added, then essentially everyone could be found guilty of everything. The key example was that of Hans Fritsch, the radio journalist. Judge Nikitchenko said, quote, "It is no crime to speak over the radio, but as long as he's a member of the conspiracy, he's guilty of the other crimes," end quote. The discussions continued endlessly. However, the prosecution, by now, had rather settled into their life of luxury in Nuremberg, all at the expense of the German taxpayer now, and for future generations, of course, in the form of reparations. Judge Biddle wrote to a friend on July the 10th, quote, "Life at the villa is completely spoiling me. For instance, last night for dinner, we had a most excellent cauliflower soup, cold trout with mayonnaise, stewed veal, fresh peas, a delicious salad with just the right amount of garlic, and gooseberry tarts. On the other side, dry martinis and some Martell brandy, which Madame de Fels had sent over. Does it make your mouth water?" End quote. Meanwhile, the Goering family, who had by now been released from their arbitrary captivity, except Hermann of course, were living in a cottage deep in the forest at Sackdeling without water or electricity. Emmy sent a letter to the tribunal, begging to be allowed to see her husband. Quote, "I haven't seen my husband for a year and a quarter, and I am longing so terribly for him that I don't see any way out. I need strength to carry on without my husband. My husband is very much worried about my child and myself, as we are without protection and help," end quote. The tribunal allowed her to come and see her husband. However, Commandant Colonel Andrus disallowed it. In late August, Judge Jackson was recalled to the United States in semi-disgrace, as the trials had gone on for so long. The public, so long ago now, had been led to believe that the trials would be done and dusted by the close of 1945, and yet here they were, deep into 1946. On the 1st of September, Keitel began writing his memoirs, quote, "For myself and for my family, how I wish that I had been granted an upright and honourable soldier's death. Why did fate deny me that on July the 20th, 1944, in the course of the attempt on the Führer's life?" End quote. Within just a week's time, his memoirs had already spanned to the Blomberg-Fritsch affair of January 1938. He was certainly eager to get his writing finished before his time was up, and indeed, he did, as his memoirs exist today. Jodl, a few rooms over, refused to accept that he deserved his fate. He wrote to his wife, quote, "Perhaps it will turn out to be more favourable than we feared in our darkest hours. Perhaps it will be worse than we hoped for in the brightest," end quote. And he said that if it was the latter, then, quote, "It will find in me not a broken and rueful prey, but a proud man looking straight into its eye sockets," end quote. Jodl also began to cook up his final words. He said that the German armed forces had found themselves with an impossible task, quote, "to wage a war which they had not wanted, under a supreme commander whose confidence they lacked, and whom they did not unconditionally trust, who often flouted basic principles of command and tried and tested viewpoints, using troop units and police forces which were not completely under their command, and guided by an intelligence service which was working partially for the enemy," end quote. As for himself, he said, quote, "And that is why I, members of the tribunal, regardless of what sentence you pronounce upon me, shall leave this courtroom with my head held high, as when I entered it so many months ago, in a war like this, in which hundreds of thousands of women and children were killed by saturation bombing, and in which the partisans used every, and I mean every, means to their desired end. Tough methods, however questionable under international law, do not amount to crimes of morality or conscience." End quote. Goering too had prepared his closing address. Quote, "The German people trusted the Führer. Given his authoritarian direction of the state, they had no influence on events. Ignorant of the crimes of which we know today, the people have fought with loyalty, self-sacrifice and courage, and they have suffered too in this life and death struggle, in which they were arbitrarily thrust. The German people are free from blame." End quote. With his own death, Hermann Goering hoped to free the German people of their own guilt. The most daring of all the closing speeches, however, was delivered by Rudolf Hess on the 31st of August. Throughout the entire trials, he had barely spoken a word, and now, with the opportunity to speak to the entire world which was currently listening, he said the following, quote, "To me was granted to work for many years of my life under the greatest sun my country has brought forth in 1,000 years of history. Even if I were able, I should not want to erase this epoch from my past existence. I am happy to know that I have done my duty to my people, my duty as a German, as a National Socialist, and as a true disciple of the Führer. I regret nothing. Were I to live my life again, I should act once more as I have acted now, even though I knew that at the end a funeral pyre was already flickering for my immolation. I care not what mere mortals may do. The time will come when I shall stand before the judgment seat of the Eternal. I shall answer unto him, and I know that he will judge me innocent." End quote. On the 2nd of September, there was a significant development. Colonel Andrus told the tribunal that the defendants could now be allowed to see their wives and lawyers and talk together. The tribunal approved, and on that afternoon they began to debate their verdicts on individual defendants. With Goering, there was unanimous agreement that he was guilty on all counts. Hess, however, caused them more trouble. Most agreed that he was guilty of counts 1 and 2, that being conspiracy and crimes against peace. But as for counts 3 and 4, aka war crimes and crimes against humanity, there was a lot more trouble. The Russians wanted him found guilty, and they argued that his signature on the Nuremberg race laws made him, quote, "guilty of killing the Jews," end quote. Biddle, meanwhile, wrote in his notes, quote, "Russians are going to be very extreme," end quote. Ribbentrop was found guilty on all counts, as was Keitel. When it came to Rosenberg, there was a divide again. Most found him guilty of all counts, however Lawrence suggested he be given life imprisonment rather than death. With Hans Frank, there was again disagreement. The Americans voted for counts 1, 3 and 4, and the Russians as usual wanted him declared guilty of all 4 counts. This theme continued. Most agreed on counts 1 and 3 for Frick, yet the Russians continued to push for 4, and on this occasion, the English did too. SS Obergruppenführer Kaltenbrunner, too, was a problem. The Russians pushed for all 4 counts. Others disagreed massively. Jodl was found guilty on all 4 counts by the Americans and the Russians, whereas the Brits and the French were more lenient. Bormann, who was dead, was tried in absentia. The Russians felt there wasn't enough proof that he was dead, and they pushed for him to be convicted on all 4 counts. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was rapidly found guilty of all 4 counts. The situation with Streicher was strange indeed. Irving writes, quote, "The judges all wanted to hang Julius Streicher for something, but disagreed strongly about what. Flacco, Donadieu, Parker, Biddle, Burkett, Lawrence and the Russians scattered their choice between counts 1, 3 and 4, seemingly at random. In a diary note, which reveals both the mood at these sentencing sessions and the superficial reasoning which decided between life and death, Biddle recorded, "The Russians, Falco and even the British are talking of holding defendants guilty on account of the positions they held. Streicher, Volchkov says, for instance, was personally connected with Hitler. I blurt out that I think it's preposterous to hold a little Jew baiter as a conspirator because he was a friend of Hitler, or a Gauleiter, or a Nazi. Lawrence bridles in and says I have bad manners. Parker pours oil on the water and says we must limit the theory of conspiracy and that Streicher had nothing to do with planning or conspiracy." End quote. Walter Funk was found guilty on all 4 counts by most. Fritz Sauckel was meanwhile found guilty on mostly 3 and 4, yet the Russians, as always, pushed for all 4. Albert Speer, later to his horror, was found guilty on counts 3 and 4. Neurath, the former foreign minister, was found to be guilty on all 4 counts. On the 6th of September, they resumed their discussion, and Lord Lawrence immediately said that he wanted to see Dr. Hjalmar Schacht acquitted, to the horror of the Frenchman, Donadieu, who said that he would go along with light sentences for men like Papen and Schacht, but not acquittals. He said that on a moral level, he would be disgusted to see Keitel condemned to death and Schacht acquitted. The Russians, too, were especially horrified. There was disagreement over Papen, another light offender. The only sticking point was his involvement with the Anschluss, yet the Americans still pressed for acquittal, since they said there was no evidence he'd actually done anything wrong in any of his offices. As for the Anschluss, Biddle noted, quote, "had nothing to do with it. To take over embassy at Ankara was hardly a criminal act. No evidence he tried to bring Turkey into the war. Acquit," end quote. The next day, the Russians made a belated attempt to push for Papen's hanging. Irving writes, quote, "asking whether they could not agree that the Nazi regime, after the seizure of power, had violated the Versailles Treaty and rearmed Germany with a view to aggressive war, became in that event, so the Russians argued, each and every official of the party was culpable to some degree. The Russians felt that they should find Papen guilty on all 4 counts," end quote. Dönitz, too, split the judges apart. Biddle, however, wrote, quote, "the essence of the charge is Dönitz's conduct of the submarine warfare. The other charges are trifling. Testimony proves that he did not have any orders from Dönitz. How silly for us to say he was guilty for not giving warning and saving survivors, when doing so would have made use of submarines impossible, when Britain ordered all merchantmen to be armed and to fight back, and Nimitz was giving orders to sink without warnings, and not to save survivors. Germany waged a much cleaner war than we did," end quote. The English disagreed, and Biddle felt they had lost touch with reality. They, after all, had started exactly what they were accusing Dönitz of. The Americans, too, had sunk opposing vessels without warning. With Admiral Raeder, however, Biddle thought that he should be shot. Others found him guilty on the 2nd and 3rd counts, and the Americans on count 1 as well. Last was Bolder von Schirach. Everyone found him guilty of count 4, except for Lawrence, and the Russians added count 1. And so, by the 10th of September, when they convened to take a final vote, most verdicts were already agreed in advance. Goering was an open and shut case. Everyone wanted him dead. Donadieu, the Frenchman, said he had a certain nobility about him, and thus deserved the firing squad instead of the rope, yet this plea fell on deaf ears. Hess, despite Russian pleas for his death, ended up with life imprisonment. Little did the judges know, however, that this would mean Hess would outlive the lot of them, languishing in Spandau for another 41 years, until he was strangled to death, most likely by his African-American guard. Ribbentrop's final decision, too, was open and shut, and so was Keitel, but with Donadieu once again demanding a firing squad, although he was ignored again. Kaltenbrunner was to get the rope, as was Rosenberg. On the latter, the Frenchman, yet again, begged for life imprisonment, yet to no avail. And so it went on. Hans Frank was to be put to death, yet the Frenchman suggested life imprisonment. Once again, he found himself overruled. Frick, death. Streicher, death. Eventually, when it came to Walter Funk, Donadieu had some luck. He stressed that Funk had no involvement with waging aggressive war, and whilst everyone else wanted to hang him, Donadieu remained steadfast, and managed to get the decision held over. Funk, essentially, had the Frenchman alone to thank for giving him another 14 years of life. Sokol, the Manpower Commissioner, was to be hung, and all agreed. Jodel's decision was delayed, as many had sympathy for him, but ultimately, he too would meet his end. Says Ingart, unanimous for death. As for Speer, Irving writes, quote, "On Albert Speer, opinion was hopelessly divided. An indication of how far he'd won over some of the judges with his methods, but failed to deceive others. There evolved a general agreement that he was guilty on counts 3 and 4, particularly the use of slave labour. The French wanted to imprison him. While John Park found himself impressed by Speer's personality and the extent to which prosecutor Robert Jackson had respected him, his senior colleague Francis Biddle felt that Speer deserved to hang on those 2 counts. Unusually, he found the Russian general and his deputy strongly supporting him, while expanding the guilty, as usual, to all 4 counts. Lord Justice Lawrence, finding perhaps some affinity with Speer's suave personality, agreed with Professor Donadieu, suggesting that the slave labour system which Speer took over was already in existence. He proposed 15 years. De Varbs seconded him, forming an unholy alliance. Biddle and Nitochenko held out for the death penalty. The debate swayed to and fro. "We can't agree," recorded Biddle finally. Norman Burkitt, who had been absent working on drafts, came in and voted for 10 years. Unable to resolve their differences, they adjourned until the morrow, end quote. When they came back to Speer the next day, an agreement was reached on 15 years. Former Foreign Minister von Neurath also got 15 years. Bormann was sentenced to death in absentia. Former Hitler Youth leader von Schirach got 20. Raeder was less lucky, he got life. His successor, Dönitz, got 10. Schacht was given 8 years from the day he was arrested, but there would be a twist in his tale yet to come. With Papen and Fritsch, however, there was still huge debate between acquittal or a prison term. As promised, family visits were now allowed for the first time. On the 12th of September, Emmy Goering came for her half-an-hour meeting to see her husband. Between them stood a wire mesh partition, and next to her handcuffed husband stood a guard with a Thompson machine gun. On the 17th, Edda Goering, Hermann's 8-year-old daughter, was able to visit her father too. He asked her to stand on a chair so he could see how much she had grown, and then she recited some poetry she had learned. Before her departure, she said, quote, "Papa, when will you come home? Will you please put on your rubber medals in the bath like people say you do?" End quote. That night, the 17th, saw a great change regarding Schacht's fate. A few days prior, Donadieu, who had staunchly wanted to jail Schacht, suddenly changed his mind. Biddle, quite rightly, recorded, quote, "I wonder what the English have done to him," end quote. Lawrence, the prime British suspect, swore he hadn't spoken to the Frenchman, but clearly, very clearly in the Americans' eyes, something had happened behind the scenes. In these days, Keitel had a visit from his son, and the latter, Karl Heinz, took notes. His father had accepted his fate, and said that he expected to meet a firing squad. He wasn't entirely at peace, however. He lamented at how tricky both Speer and Schacht had been. Speer, he recalled, had gaily waved farewell to the other prisoners when he was driven away at Mondorf. In Speer's eyes, he had got away scot-free. As for Keitel himself, he was now a man worn down by the mental torment of his time in prison, and twice with his son he was close to tears. He also spoke of how little the Allies seemed to understand his role. Quote, "Life at the Führer's headquarters was literally like living behind barbed wire, just like at Nuremberg, only as chief of the High Command," end quote. 3 days later, in the same vein, quote, "In World War I, as Chief Operations Officer, I shared with my commanding officer tactical responsibility for an entire division. In World War II, as a Field Marshal and Chief of the OKV, I was permitted to issue orders only to my driver and my valet," end quote. Most importantly, he stated that Germany had chosen the right path. Everyone was rearming, and Hitler was the only man who could make Germany survive such a scenario. Quote, "One man must have the will, and must then allow nothing to distract him. One must have faith. Otherwise, one might as well give up there and then." Hitler had considered himself the only man capable of generating the faith that was an essential requisite for victory, end quote. With the passage of time, Keitel added, Adolf Hitler would be viewed as a great genius. As for the prosecutors, they set about preparing things for Judgment Day, which kept getting postponed. Colonel Andrus, however, only had one thing on his mind. Nothing at all must happen between then and now. He wanted no dramatic assassinations, no suicides, no disturbances, nothing. Everything was to remain in place so that the Allies could have the joy of hanging the men they deemed fit to die and jailing the men they deemed fit to jail. On the 29th of September, the prisoners' wives were expelled from the building, ready for the big day. Before leaving her husband, Emmy Goering said, quote, "Don't you believe that we shall one day be together in freedom?" End quote. Hermann simply replied, quote, "I beg of you, give up hope." End quote. The Reichsmarshal was absolutely correct. On the 30th of September, the courtroom was full to the brim, and cameras were banned whilst the sentences were read out. 19 of the 22 defendants were found guilty, and 4 of the indicted organisations were declared to have been criminal in character, those being the SS, the SD, the Gestapo, and of course, the Nazi Party itself. Fritsch and Papen were acquitted on all counts after all, and as mentioned earlier, there was a twist in the tale. Schacht, too, was to be acquitted miraculously. When this was read out, Goering threw down his headphones in disgust. The story didn't end here for these 3 men, however. The 3 of them initially wrote to Colonel Andrus asking for the protection of the Nuremberg jail until they could be escorted elsewhere. They did not feel safe in the new Germany. Quote, "To Colonel Andrus, we herewith request accommodation at the Nuremberg jailhouse until such time as transportation to American protection can be laid on." End quote. The Americans, in turn, offered to transport them anywhere they liked in the American zone. Schacht, for some reason, turned down this offer. As soon as he was released from his cell, German police stepped forward and arrested him, and he was duly sentenced to 8 years imprisonment as a major offender under the new denazification laws. He ended up serving 2 years in solitary confinement, and was released in 1948. His connections got him past the Allies, but not past his own countrymen. On the 1st of October, the tribunal reassembled to pass sentence. Speer, in the meantime, had already begun celebrating with his lawyer. The latter, Dr. Hans Flaschner, exclaimed, quote, "After listening to that, I think you'll get perhaps 4 to 5 years, end quote. He was in for a shock. Up first that day, however, was Hermann Goering, and up he stepped at 3 p.m. Lawrence read the sentence, quote, "Defendant Hermann Wilhelm Goering, the International Military Court sentences you to death by hanging," end quote. It's worth remembering that Goering, and Keitel especially, made a huge deal about getting honourable deaths via firing squad. To military men like these, hanging was a most shameful way to go. Ribbentrop came next, and to everyone's surprise, he barely showed a hint of emotion as he heard he was to be hung. The same was the case of Keitel and Kaltenbrunner. In total, 12 of the defendants have been put to death. Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Bormann, Rosenberg, Jodl, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Saukel, and Seyss Ingat. Bormann, of course, was already dead, but the Russians refused to accept this fact, even now. When it was Jodl's turn, his face was immediately covered with disbelief. Jackson had even felt a profound respect for Jodl, and he knew full well he wasn't a political soldier like Keitel. Regardless, he got the rope. As mentioned earlier, Chirac and Speer got 20 years apiece, Neurath 15, Dönitz 10, and Hess, Funk, and Raeder got life sentences. And so, Jackson's job was done. He was of course to have nothing to do with the executions, and so off he went, back to Washington. Things were now in the hands of Colonel Andrus and the army. Regardless, Jackson had been proud of his handiwork. In France there had been similar trials, and 2,853 people had been condemned to death. The French resistance, on top of this, had already executed 8,348 people without trial. At Dachau, the US Army war crimes trials had been brutal in the extreme. Prisoners had been subjected to the worst possible conditions, including savage beatings, intimidation to sign false conditions, and mock trials of hooded prisoners to get them to pin the blame on their fellow prisoners. It's often mentioned that most German prisoners had their testicles crushed. However, this is falsely attributed to Nuremberg. This was the case at Dachau and pretty much everywhere else in Germany, but not here. Jackson's trials, whilst harsh, had by these standards been sort of benevolent. He had performed his task to a T, whatever the faults. Importantly, Irving writes, quote, "All the defendants agreed they would have suffered far greater indignities at the hands of their fellow countrymen had they been put before German courts." End quote. Meanwhile, back at Nuremberg, the condemned men sat in their cells in silence, contemplating their fates. Goering saw Dr. Gilbert hovering around his door, but dismissed him and asked to be left alone. Keitel, meanwhile, wrote to his counsel, quote, "The death sentence has come to me as no surprise, but I am very deeply upset about the way it is to be executed. I beg of you, under these circumstances, to avail me of your selfless assistance once more, to help me make a plea for my execution to be changed to a soldier's death by firing squad. I consider it pointless to ask more than that." End quote. Jodl, however, had not expected death. He wrote to his wife, quote, "It's my fault that you didn't receive my wristwatch and lighter, because I don't want to lose sight of them, as I was expecting the sentence to go differently." End quote. Dr. Flucker, the much-loved German doctor, came to try to comfort him and help him with his appetite. He told Jodl, quote, "You're a true Roman," end quote. To which Jodl replied, quote, "I'm not as good as they were at controlling my emotions. I've got too bold a spirit, and too big a heart," end quote. He was suffering bitterly. He wrote again to his dear wife, telling her that he felt something like a clamp tightening on his heart. He had only felt this pain 2 times before in his life. Firstly, when his first wife died, and secondly, when he had to sign the German surrender at Reims on the 7th of May, 1945. Regardless, the condemned were left to wallow. They had 15 days, excluding Sundays, from the day of sentencing. Then, their lives would abruptly come to an end. Irving writes, quote, "Undisputed king of his own castle now that the lawyers had gone, Colonel Burton C. Andrus stepped up security precautions in the jailhouse still further to ensure that nothing went wrong before then. He refused Goering all further outside exercise and did not allow him the regular showers due to him on the 4th and 11th. Prisoner health was now a matter of indifference. Sudden searches were the order of the day. On the 5th, Andrus ordered the straw paillasse on Goering's cot changed without warning. During each of the remaining 7 interviews outside his cell, Goering was securely handcuffed to a sentinel." End quote. Keitel, meanwhile, wrote to the Allied Control Council, quote, "I will willingly give up my life in the expiation demanded by the sentence, if my sacrifice will speed the prosperity of the German people and serve to exonerate the German armed forces from blame. I have only one plea, to be granted a death by firing squad." End quote. Raeder, meanwhile, actually appealed to be given the death penalty as he couldn't face a life sentence. Goering, like Keitel, wrote in to request a firing squad death instead of a dishonourable hanging. All of these appeals came to naught. In fact, as it was later revealed, the British Foreign Secretary had sent a secret cable instructing the Brits to deny any and all appeals, and so it went. The Labour government had decided, as they wrote in a telegram, quote, "From a political point of view, it would be an advantage if there were no alterations of the sentence." End quote. Despite this, however, Jodl's appeal was actually considered by the tribunal. But due to the Brits and their secret telegram, Jodl was to be condemned to death by hanging, despite the fact that almost all of the tribunal considered him an upright soldier, at least deserving of a firing squad. In 1953, during a denazification proceeding in Munich, Jodl's name was effectively cleared, and he was rehabilitated posthumously. The decision was based on Donahue's later statement that in his view the conviction had been without merit and a miscarriage of justice. Regardless, Jodl seemed to look for solace in the arms of the Lord. He laid in his bed, listening to the organ in the church next to the prison. Quote, as it wafts its pure and gentle noises through the walls to me, end quote. The convicted men were also being allowed to see their families one last time on any day of their choosing between the 6th and 12th of October. On the 7th, Emmy Goering came to see her husband for the final time. He said that he hoped life would not be too hard on his dear Edda, to which she replied, quote, "You may die with your conscience pure. You have done here in Nuremberg all that you could for your comrades and for Germany," end quote. He replied, quote, "I had no idea that you were so brave. Listen closely. Do you still have your comb and brush?" End quote. Emmy said that she had, and then asked Hermann if he had what Ango, aka Victor Bueller, had given him. Bueller, a year prior, had given Hermann a few cyanide capsules. He replied, quote, "No, I would have liked to say yes, because that would make it easier for you," end quote. He wasn't lying, as right now he did not have a suicide pill on his person. In the Nuremberg storage room, however, all this time had laid a brass cartridge containing cyanide. Soon enough, they had to part ways, and then Dr. Flucker went to see Hermann in his cell. The Reichsmarshal said, quote, "I've just seen my wife for the last time, my dear doctor. Now I am dead. It was a difficult hour, but she wanted it. She bore up magnificently. She only faltered towards the end," end quote. On the 13th, the prisoners could hear trucks moving equipment 100 feet away. As it turned out, this was the gallows being unloaded. Now faced with his own mortality, Fritz Sauckel began to scream. Goering, who overheard the ruckus, said he wished there was something he could do to help his friend. On the 14th, Goering was talking with Pastor Jericho. Goering, much to his dismay, was refused Holy Communion. Jericho, who we'll look more at in the next video, later recalled, quote, "I refused him the Lord's Supper because he denied the divinity of Christ, who instituted this sacrament. He became more discouraged because I insisted he couldn't meet Edda, his daughter, in heaven if he refused the Lord's way to salvation," end quote. Pastor Jericho and his Catholic counterpart, Father O'Connor, were of course both indispensable to the prisoners during their last days on earth. On the 15th, Father O'Connor visited Yodel and gave him his eagerly awaited last letters from his wife. Shortly after his departure, it appears that Yodel had finally devoted himself to Christ. He wrote to his wife, quote, "Father Sixtus just saw me, and now I know for sure that I have made mistakes, I know, but if there is a God in heaven, as I think he is, and as only he can be, then he will forgive me my sins," end quote. Also on the 15th, Goering realised that tonight was his last night on earth. He sat down in his cell and wrote up one last document, quote, "I find it tasteless in the extreme to stage our deaths as a show for sensation-seeking reporters, photographers, and the curious. This grand final is typical of the abysmal depths plumbed by court and prosecution, pure theatre from start to finish, all rotten comedy. I understand perfectly well that our enemies want to get rid of us, whether out of fear or hatred, but it would serve their reputation better to do the deed in a soldierly manner. I, myself, shall be dying without all this sensation and publicity. Let me stress once more that I feel not the slightest moral or other obligation to submit to a death sentence or execution by my enemies and those of Germany. I proceed to the hereafter with joy, and I regard death as a release. I shall hope for my God's mercy. I deeply regret that I cannot help my comrades, particularly Field Marshal Keitel and General Yodel, to escape this public death spectacle as well. This entire effort to stop us from doing harm to ourselves was never motivated by concern for our welfare, but purely to make sure that all would be ready for the big sensation. But count me out, Hermann Goering," end quote. Meanwhile, the international journalists who had been selected for the executions the next day were to go and peep at the prisoners for one last time. Kingsbury Smith, reporting to International News in New York, wrote the following, quote, "I stood looking at Goering over the shoulder of a prison sentinel, whose duty it was to observe Goering constantly. With the eyes of an American security guard watching him like a cat watches a rat, Goering had little hope of emulating Lay's act, even if he had entertained such an idea," end quote. The journalist then went on to gloat that Hermann would have the longest walk to the gallows, as cell 5 was at the far end of death row. At 7:30 p.m, Father Jericho came to see Goering again, and asked him if he had completely surrendered his heart and soul to Jesus Christ. Goering replied that he was a Christian, and that he felt at ease. At 8:30 p.m, Private Gordon Bingham peeped into Goering's cell and all seemed normal. At 9:30, Dr. Flucker came to see Hermann, and the guard said he saw the German doctor hand his Reichsmarshal a pill. Flucker would later admit in testimony that this was Goering's usual pill, but filled with baking soda instead of sedative, as he didn't want Goering to fall asleep that night. Shaking hands was completely forbidden, yet Hermann wished the doctor good night, and the two shook hands warmly. Flucker, almost certainly, was the one who handed Hermann a brass capsule, somehow, and now Goering laid perfectly still in deep thought. This was his turning point. He then lifted his left hand up and clenched, as if shielding his eyes from the light beam. Little did the guard who had been looking through the peephole know, however, that Goering just put a cyanide capsule in his mouth. At 10:44 p.m, everything was as normal according to the guard, and in just over an hour, at midnight, Hermann Goering was due to hang. Suddenly, however, there was pandemonium. At 10:47 p.m, there was a horrible blowing and choking sound coming from Goering's cell. Shortly afterwards, telephones rang, the lights blazed at full voltage, and army boots clattered all over the catwalks. The bitter, almond-like smell from within Goering's cell was unmistakable. He had beaten the hangman's noose. Several letters were found in his cell, which read the following, quote, "To the Allied Control Council, I would have let you shoot me without further ado, but it is not possible to hang the German Reichsmarshal. I cannot permit this for Germany's sake. Besides, I have no moral obligation to submit to the justice of my enemies. I have therefore chosen the manner of death of the great Hannibal, Hermann Goering." End quote. And quote, "Dear Pastor Jericho, forgive me, but I had to do it like this for political reasons. I have prayed long to my God, and feel that I am doing the right thing. I would have let them shoot me. Please comfort my wife and tell her that this was no ordinary suicide, and that she can rest assured that God will still gather me up in his great mercy. God protect my dearest ones. God bless you, dear pastor, evermore. Your Hermann Goering." End quote. He had thrown the entire spectacle into disarray, and the Americans seemed to be in a worse state than the men due to be executed. The entire show had been based on Goering. He was going to be the first to hang. There was an immediate delay, but regardless, the show went on for the rest of them. At 1:29 a.m, Ribbentrop was brought into the execution chamber. His last words were, quote, "God save Germany and be merciful on my soul. My last wish is for a united Germany, understanding between East and West, and peace on earth." End quote. He did have one more thing to say. He turned to Pastor Jericho, by now a great friend of his, and said, quote, "I'll see you again." End quote. Keitel was next. He finished his speech with, quote, "More than 2 million German soldiers died for their fatherland. I now follow them and my sons who gave their all for Germany." End quote. It wasn't an easy death. The gallows had deliberately been put together badly, and the result was a horror show. As soon as Keitel dropped, the heavy trapdoor swung back and smashed every bone in his face, and the same thing happened to the next man, Kaltenbrunner. The former SS man said, quote, "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I am sorry my people were led this time by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge. Germany, good luck." End quote. Rosenberg went to the rope with a disturbing coolness. When asked if he had anything he wanted to say, he simply said, no. He too wasn't going to let the prosecutors make a show of his death. Hans Frank was quite the opposite. He had genuinely repented of his crimes and had converted to Catholicism during his imprisonment. His last words were, quote, "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy." End quote. Frick was next, who screamed, quote, "Long live the eternal Germany." End quote. Streicher had quite the spectacle planned. He said that today was Purim, a holy day in the Jewish calendar, commemorating the deliverance of the Jews in Persia from destruction by Haman. He shouted out, quote, "Heil Hitler, this is a joyous Jewish festival, but it is my Purim festival. The day will come when the Bolsheviks will hang the lot of you." End quote. Soon enough, he was dead. Purim, however, was actually in February after all. Fritz Saukel was next, by now a broken man. He stammered, quote, "I die an innocent man, God save Germany, and make her great again." End quote. Then came Jodl, who stood upright and proclaimed proudly, quote, "I send you greetings, my Germany." End quote. Says Ingard, the well-spoken former lawyer, was last, quote, "I hope that this execution is the final act in the tragedy of World War II, and that people will learn from this example, so that truth and understanding can be restored among the nations. I believe in Germany." End quote. He was hung at 2:57 a.m, and with his death, the executions were complete. The bodies were then all dragged out so that official photographs could be taken of each with a name tag. Later, strangely, the bodies were then stripped naked and photographed again. The bodies were placed in coffins and taken to Dachau, incinerated, and the ashes were then scattered in the Isar River. Jackson was far from happy with how the executions had gone. The Brits and the Germans wisely didn't publicise the photos, yet the Americans did, and Jackson rightly felt this might stir sympathies. Quote, "People saw the dead Nazis and didn't see the 6 million dead victims. I had a very low opinion of the army's handling of the executions and of the publicity." End quote. Jackson even drafted a letter to a national newspaper, protesting what he termed the ghoulish treatment of Goering's mortal remains. He decided not to send it, however, in order to avoid controversy. The strange treatment of the deceased continued. Several items of the utmost historical importance were destroyed for seemingly no reason other than spite. Irving writes, quote, "As for the captured regalia of the late prisoners, they made a sad little list. All of Keitel's medals won in 2 wars were ordered to be destroyed, as well as his 2 Iron Crosses, his 4 wound medals, his Luftwaffe dagger, and his Field Marshal's baton. To the finance director of the US zone, to help defray the cost of the trial, would go his 2 gold party badges. Jodel's 3 Iron Crosses, wound medal, and various campaign ribbons were ordered destroyed, as were Goering's famous blue Max. The Pour le Mérite awarded him as commander of the Richthofen Squadron in World War I, and his 2 Iron Crosses, forwarded to the Finance Directorate after destruction of Nazi insignia, were his 2 Spread Eagle Nazi Party badges, made of platinum and studded with diamonds and other gewgaws. At a subsequent meeting, the commission ordered that since Mrs. Alfred Rosenberg had written that she did not desire any of the personal possessions of her late husband, these, being of insignificant value, were to be destroyed, as well as the diamond-encrusted U-boat medal belonging to Admiral Dönitz, which was to be forwarded to the finance director after the swastika had been obliterated." End quote. All of this was nothing compared to the chaos that Hermann Goering had brought, however. Quote, "Goering's suicide ruined Colonel Andrus's week, month, year, and indeed the rest of his life. Months earlier, the Templars had invited him to attend their dinner at the Criterion restaurant in Piccadilly, London, on October the 19th, in honour of Lord Justice Lawrence, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, Sir Norman Burkitt, and the tribunal's other members of the Inner Temple's Masonic Lodge. Even with the Quadripartite Commission busy here," he now wrote apologising, "and making great demands upon my time, I still would have arranged to come, but the suicide of that horrible criminal created so many complications that it was absolutely impossible for me to be away. In an act of petty revenge, he ordered the surviving prisoners' rations cut and all bread and sugar allowances cancelled." End quote. Moments before Colonel Andrus died 21 years later of leukemia, he said in his delirium, quote, "I have just been told that Goering has committed suicide. I must go and see to this matter." End quote. These were his final words, and until his death, he refused to accept the story of what happened. Simply put, as it turned out, Goering had been working with Dr. Flucker and the Lieutenant Jack G. Wheelis from Texas mentioned earlier. And thus the Nuremberg trials were over, but the struggle for the Germans was not. Says Ingart in his final words, wished his death to be the last tragedy of World War II, yet it was not. All over Germany, the US Army was currently torturing and murdering Germans by the thousand, many in trials which didn't even try to give the appearance of legality. It would be a long, long time until the American retaliation ended, and indeed, the nation of Germany still has tens of thousands of American troops in its borders today. The trials did not bring an end to wars of aggression either. As if to stress the point, Rudolf Hess's lawyer, Alfred Seidel, inquired of the British Foreign Office in 1956 whether Prime Minister Eden would be brought before any tribunal for his war against Egypt with Israel and France. At the end of this video, I was going to do a chapter on the faith of the defendants, but as the story between them and Pastor Cherokee and Father O'Connor, the US Army chaplains, was so interesting, I decided that I'd simply make that into a new video, which I'll release after this one. I also didn't want to drag this video out any longer than it's already been dragged. Whether you think the trials were fair, I will leave up to you, but undoubtedly, many of the defendants had indeed committed various crimes, and for them, there was really no way out. In comparison to the other trials going on throughout Germany at the time, too, Jackson's trials were extremely mild. At the end of the day, the Germans were the vanquished, and the United States, now the senior partner in the West, and the Soviet Union were the victors. Jackson alone made sure that these men got a trial that was as fair as it was, no matter the faults of the trial in practice. The alternative would surely have been death for everyone involved, and so ultimately, even if these trials too were a farce, then the leading Germans were between a rock and a hard place. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did make it this far, then please do leave a like and share the video. It helps immensely. As always though, the biggest thank you of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly HOI4 or EU4 games, then please do consider signing up in one of the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps immensely. Thank you.